Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Rachel Knox, and I am the president of CHEM, the Cannabis Health Equity Movement. My background is in family, integrative, and functional medicine, but for the past 6 years, I've practiced what we call today functional endocannabinology and cannabinoid medicine. So for years, I have seen patients in the clinic in my home state of Oregon, but as well in California and Washington and others to counsel patients on the appropriate clinical application of cannabis for medical purposes. The hats that I've worn in this space over the past 6 years are varied. I chaired the Oregon Cannabis Commission for 3 years, so I also have experience as a regulatory and policy consultant, specifically in the area of cannabis health equity, which is what we, the CHEM Coalition, are so excited to teach you all about today. So we're going to kick off this portion of the symposium with the essential history of cannabis in the United States. And I am very excited to take a walk with you all through this history, not told. Even from within the cannabis space, the history we commonly tell tends to focus on the plant, its natural history and origin, right? The era of prohibition, the war on drugs, and scientific discovery. But as is true of most traditional education in the United States, the traditional accounting of the journey of cannabis has been washed of its most significant and revealing truths, right? Of evidence that deeply roots it in our earliest experiences within American colonialism and throughout the institution of American slavery. And this history can no longer be ignored as many of us tirelessly fight to justify social justice and cannabis policy and regulation that we hope creates equity and restitution for our communities, right? Our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people in particular who've suffered the most at the helm of prohibition. So as you'll soon learn, there is no justification necessary. All right, so over the course of this talk, I will review an inclusive but not exhaustive history of cannabis in the United States, before dissecting the effects of cannabis prohibition on the resilience and well-being of our communities. I'll then close with a brief overview of the role cannabis health equity will play as we write our own history within cannabis. So these words have been credited to Thomas Jefferson, founding father and third president of the United States. And he said that hemp is of the first necessity to the wealth and protection of the country. Now, wealth and protection of our country was and remains vitally important. So I think both you and I should find it quite odd that for the past 48 years, from 1970 to 2018, that hemp was classified as a dangerous and otherwise useless Schedule I drug, right? Now, you may be asking yourself, which I did of myself, why? Right? Or how does a plant held in such high esteem at one point fall so far? The answers will make history cannabis quite sordid, which is why much of the history is conveniently ignored, right? There's hard truths that I will be sharing with you today. Facing reality will require our governments and our institutions of higher learning to acknowledge the sins of not only our country, but of our policies and positions and practices, and even the excuses we continue to tell ourselves to this day. But federalization is coming. And with federal legalization on the horizon now, right, we have to look in the mirror. So let's just dive right in and begin to do just that. All right, so let's start in 2737 BC, where we found the first documented use of cannabis as medicine recorded in an ancient Chinese pharmacopoeia called the Shenong Penchao Qing. And this pharmacopoeia detailed the agricultural and medical purposes of plants as pharmacopoeias of countries do all over the world to this day. But according to that text, cannabis was included as a fundamental herb for medical use. And around the same time, we had India's Arthura Veda, which is an ancient Sanskrit scripture, similarly identify cannabis as one of 5 sacred plants. All right, so now we know today that cannabis is made up of myriad cultivation varieties bred over centuries across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe as well. But the broad cultivation variety of cannabis known as hemp finally made its way from the East to North America in the days of colonialism, right, as early as 1606. And historical accounts confirm that Jamestown, the first English settlement in North America, grew hemp to make ropes and sails and fishing nets and clothing for themselves out of hemp's unusually strong fibers. This plant demonstrated such utility, in fact, that in 1619, the British Crown mandated that every property owner in Jamestown had to grow 100 hemp plants for export back to Britain for its versatility. And so accordingly, the Virginia Assembly passed legislation and they required property owners to grow hemp. It was illegal not to. Similar hemp decrees were issued later in Connecticut and Massachusetts as well. But this same year, the first cohort of West African slaves arrived in that same Virginia colony. Then hemp production in the colonies would boom, as it did, and it was vital in almost every part of the industrial society of those times. It was in high demand, including for its use in baling and bagging of cotton, which made the cotton industry its primary market. And in 1760, George Washington, who, as it turns out, farmed at both Mount Vernon, or excuse me, just at Mount Vernon, predicted that hemp could be more profitable than tobacco, but unfortunately had high labor costs. And these high labor costs would diminish its profitability, making its cultivation and harvesting and processing ultimately heavily dependent on slave labor. All right, now this is the one with 2 plantations. So like Washington, Thomas Jefferson participated in hemp production at Monticello, as well as the Poplar Forest plantations. And he is said to have bought his first seeds back in 1774, and then acknowledged in an 1815 quote, so a second quote that we can contribute to this guy. And that was that hemp is abundantly productive and will grow forever on the same spot. But the breaking it and beating it, which has always been done by hand, is so slow and so laborious and so much complained of by our laborers, right? So the harvesting and processing of hemp by hand was difficult and it was dirty. And it also required a large labor force, and thus the ongoing exploitation of slaves kept costs low and white hands clean. Without this exploitation, hemp, in reality, any of our cash crops, whether it's tobacco or cotton or even rice, would not have flourished so fruitfully in North America. Now, as tobacco grew in popularity in Virginia, the bulk of hemp farming and its slave labor migrated south. It went into the Carolinas and Mississippi, also west into Missouri and Kentucky. And in 1775, Kentucky saw its first hemp crop, and it would eventually become the hemp production capital of the United States. And it's been said that if it were not for hemp, Kentucky would have never become a slave-owning state in the first place. So over the next 75 years, hemp became the 3rd largest agricultural commodity behind only cotton and tobacco in total production, a pace that continued to demand free labor. I hope you guys are catching the theme here. And by 1850, hemp was flourishing. In that year, the US Census counted 8,327 hemp plantations, spanning at least 2,000 acres each. In his 1951, A History of the Hemp Industry in Kentucky, author James F. Hopkins wrote a historical account of a Lexingtonian who stated that it was almost impossible to hire workmen to break a crop of hemp because the work was very dirty and so laborious that scarcely any white man will work at it. And he goes on to account further that Kentuckians sometimes referred to hemp as a nigger crop. Let that sink in for a second, right? Owing to a belief that no one understood this plant better. No one understood the eccentricities of hemp cultivation and harvest as well, or as expert as the Negro. So we understand that without slave labor, hemp would not have become Kentucky's most important cash crop. It certainly wouldn't have been the third most productive crop in the United States that contributed to the wealth of this nation during slavery. All right, also in 1850, we'll depart from that theme for a moment. While hemp was accelerating towards peak production in our country, cannabis was added to the American Pharmacopoeia. Right, I mentioned before that pharmacopoeias are the books that really codify the agricultural and medical purposes of plants. So it landed in our pharmacopoeia in 1850, having first been introduced to Western, medicine and medical society by a guy named Dr. William O'Shaughnessy, and this was in 1837. And he brought his knowledge of the medicinal plant from much time spent in India learning about it. And he first brought it to England and then on to the United States. And I will quickly note that by the early 1900s, cannabis accounted for more than 50% of prescriptions written by physicians in the United States. It was a popular over-the-counter remedy as well, stocked in medicine cabinets of families across the country. Prominent pharmaceutical companies that you'd recognize by name today, like Eli Lilly or Park Davis, which is now Pfizer, were major producers of cannabis medicines from the mid-1800s to early 1900s. All right, but we're not going to jump too far ahead there. We will get back to that. But first, back in 1859, this is when we saw absolute peak performance out of Kentucky hemp production, amounting to 40,000 tons of hemp, making up 1/3 of the 400 bagging bale rope and cordage factories in our country at that time. And at the height of hemp's production, Kentucky produced today's equivalent of $161 million worth of hemp. But production would decline during the Civil War years of 1861 through 1865 as a direct result of the significant disruption the war caused to the institution of slavery. Now, with the decline of slave labor, hemp's history didn't end, right? There are relics of the past that do indicate that hemp thrived in high esteem through the early 20th century. On this slide is the 1914 Andrew Jackson $10 bill. It was printed on hemp paper, and it also donned an illustration, I hope you guys can tell, but of hemp farming, right? And we know it's hemp farming as identified by the length of the stalks in the rendering. So also very ironically, as you'll also soon find out, this bill includes the signature of then Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. So keep his name in mind. All right, so moving on to the 1920s, when the US was introduced to smokable cannabis. Now, smokable cannabis in our country was introduced to us by Mexican farmers fleeing conflict in the Mexican Revolution. Right? Its consumption also made its way into the jazz community and the Black community at large. A use that has been accounted for by these early consumers as a form of self-medication for the marginalized who lived in poor and oppressive conditions. That was no secret. And in his biography, Louis Armstrong reflected that it makes you feel good, man. It relaxes you. It makes you forget all the bad things that happen to a Negro. It makes you feel wanted. And when you're with another tea smoker, it makes you feel a special sense of kinship. Now, I find it very interesting that these early consumers of smokable cannabis associated cannabis in that kind of way, right? In a self-care way, because their experiences were absolutely being substantiated. In 1924, Dr. Charles Sejo highlighted 3 areas of indication for cannabis medicine in his analytic Encyclopedia of Practical Medicine. And I like reading the entirety because it is really illuminating, right? So number 1, he noted that cannabis as a sedative or a hypnotic in the treatment of insomnia, senile insomnia, melancholia, mania, delirium tremens, chorea, tetanus, rabies, hay fever, bronchitis, pulmonary tuberculosis, coughs, exophthalmic goiter, spasm of the bladder, and gonorrhea. He noted it as an analgesic, right, for the treatment of pain conditions like headache and migraine, eye strain, menopause, brain tumors, neuralgia, gastric ulcers, multiple neuritis, uterine disturbances, dysmenorrhea, chronic inflammation, menorrhagia, impending abortion, postpartum hemorrhage, acute rheumatism, eczema, senile pruritus, tingling, and numbness of gout. And then lastly, you had sort of this catch-all bucket of uses to improve appetite and digestion. We've heard that one before, right? When Marinol was approved to treat wasting diseases like AIDS, HIV. And for pronounced anorexia following exhaustive diseases, gastric neurosis, dyspepsia, heartburn, diarrhea, hematuria, diabetes mellitus, cardiac palpitations, vertigo, sexual atony in the female, and impotence in the male. That is quite an exhaustive list of medical uses, right? Yet today we're still wondering if cannabis is medicine. But medical utility could not prevent what had already been set in motion. In 1930, the US Secretary of the Treasury, remember I wanted you to recall that name, Andrew Mellon, appointed Harry Anslinger as the director of the newly established Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the FBN. And this bureau was housed within the Department of Treasury. And he was appointed to address the unregulated drug market circumvention of taxation. Taxation, that is not a public health issue, right? Taxation. They were tired of people evading paying taxes. And by 1936, the politics surrounding hemp and marijuana were really steaming up within that context. And it was understood that cannabis innovations in construction and food and fiber and fuel, as well as medicine and paper, was about to topple the interests, right? The unique interests of industrialists like Carnegie and DuPont and William Randolph Hearst with his newspaper empire and his lumber empire, right? It threatened their burgeoning petrochemical, synthetic textile, and paper empires. As history tells it, Anslinger was married to the niece of Andrew Mellon. There's that guy again, who was not only the Secretary of the Treasury, but a financier of DuPont and his petrochemical, synthetic textile efforts. So we can all draw our own conclusions, right? But it was in 1936 that the regulation of cannabis evolved from a matter of taxation to one of outright villainization of those who consumed it as a means to drive prohibition, right? As a means to turn public sentiment. And the following year brought the Marijuana Tax Act, which we consider the first federal strike in the battle that would unseat cannabis as a thriving agricultural commodity and a medicine. And that would eventually too criminalize it. So this act deemed the cultivation, production, prescription, retail, possession, and use of cannabis illegal without the prior procurement of a marijuana tax stamp. This placed significant compliance and tax burdens on cannabis prescribing physicians, cannabis dispensing pharmacists, and cannabis growers, right? And interestingly enough, prior to it being, codified into law, the American Medical Association, right, the AMA, testified in opposition to the act. They strongly opposed the passage for numerous reasons, and they cited who it taxed, right? Physicians, pharmacists, growers, the secrecy involved in preparing the bill, the dubious claims that were used to validate its passage, and the use of the term marijuana itself. So around this time, marijuana was a new word in the American lexicon. It was not used. It wasn't associated with the plant. And the AMA thought that using this unfamiliar term at the time, rather than the word cannabis, was a ploy which would really blind physicians to what the 1937 Tax Act was really prohibiting, right? A medicine that they were very comfortable using. And AMA spokesperson, physician, and lawyer, as well as noted drug policy expert, Dr. William Woodward, testified before Congress. And he's quoted as saying that the AMA knows of no evidence that marijuana is a dangerous drug. So think about that when you think about the statements the AMA is putting out today. And we can understand, right, with all of this history, that this development was driven not by the medical community. You had the medical community opposing it, or science, but instead the industrialists and politicians of the day who saw profit in suppressing the production of this plant in favor of their own commercial interests, right, in specific areas of oil, fiber, and timber, right, which are big industries today. Now, this is, where are we, 1938? So written in 1937, but published after the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act was signed into law. This magazine, Popular Mechanics, dubbed hemp the new billion-dollar crop. They knew how productive this plant was about to be. They cited it having over 25,000 uses and applications. They called it the most profitable and desirable crop that can be grown, right? Echoing those prophetic statements and sentiments of Thomas Jefferson just a couple hundred years earlier. Yeah, let's just move on to the next slide here, because there's more, right? Just a few years later, in 1941, Henry Ford presented his groundbreaking invention, a car made out of hemp plastic and fueled by hemp ethanol, which has no doubt inspired the automotive industry today, as we're starting to see companies like BMW and others shoring up their hemp supply chains. But Ford's goal at the time was to grow automobiles from the soil. Very audacious goal, but as you can see, not so difficult to achieve. Which brings us to 1942. So amidst confusion and propaganda, cannabis was removed altogether from the American Pharmacopoeia. No wonder doctors don't know anything about this plant as medicine today. So it was removed under pressure from the federal government's insistence that it was a dangerous drug and that would have caused insanity and depraved criminal acts. At the same time, the USDA initiated the Hemp for Victory program during World War II. Right? Our country's supply of hemp from the Philippines, it was illegal here, but we brought it in from the Philippines to make things like ropes and sails for war. And the US Navy needed it. They needed the hemp to create these things. So the Tax Act was fleetingly lifted to allow for this production in our country. And then the last commercial hemp field for a long time was planted in Wisconsin in 1957. Right, so these are dueling ideologies, and they weren't only apparent in industry, right? They were also apparent in the realm of science and medicine. And we know now that in the 1960s is when we saw all the first breakthroughs in cannabis science, but not in our country, not in the United States. I think you heard a little bit about this yesterday. It was in Israel, with U.S. government funding, that renowned cannabis researcher Dr. Raphael Mechoulam identified the chemical structures of the major active constituents in cannabis, right? The phytocannabinoids CBD and THC in the years of 1963 and 1964, respectively. Also, lesser known fact, CBG was isolated and described in 1964 right alongside THC. So we've known about these molecules for quite a long time. But meanwhile, back stateside, after Nixon ignored the Schaefer report on cannabis, which called outright for its decriminalization, noting a complete lack of evidence to support the notion that it was a dangerous drug or addictive, he signed the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 into law to replace the Marijuana Tax Act. And we all know what he did. He ushered in what would soon be declared the war on drugs. And in this Controlled Substances Act, cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug alongside heroin and LSD and psilocybin, right? Psychedelic drugs that are starting to, pop back up into mainstream conversation, and represented that it had no accepted medicinal value and carried a high potential for addiction and abuse. And on June 17th, 1971, Nixon publicly declared his war on drugs and dramatically increased the size and presence of the federal drug control agencies, pushing through mandatory sentencing. So I hope this plays, but I would love to take a brief look at the footage from that announcement. Well, maybe it won't play for us. That is okay. This is YouTubeable. So I encourage you all to take a look at and listen to what he's saying, how he's saying it, and how it will be used to re-educate Americans about dangerous drugs. And as a result of this war on drugs, we saw millions of people, right, enter into the criminal justice system for cannabis-related activity. And also important to note is that this war permeated into higher education, right? Under the subsequent President Ford, American universities were prohibited from studying cannabis. So it was around this time that our own universities were just outright prohibited from touching the plant. All right. Now, moving on a little further in time, under the direction of the administration, the DEA, remember formerly the FBN, the DEA created the federally funded domestic cannabis eradication and suppression program, the only nationwide law enforcement program that exclusively targets drug trafficking organizations involved in cannabis cultivation. And by 1985, all 50 states were participating in this program, and the program remains active today. I know I was surprised to learn about this, while we're legalizing all around us, right? In 2019, the program was responsible for the eradication of over 4 million marijuana plants, as well as for 4,700 arrests and the seizure of more than $29 million of cultivator assets. And then in 2020, the DEA provided resources to support the still existing 127 state and local law enforcement agencies that participate in the program. And in the words of the DEA, this assistance allows the enhancement of already aggressive eradication enforcement activities throughout the nation. Now, we're flipping back and forth here, but now back on the research front. The late 1980s saw a renewed curiosity amongst US researchers because they wanted to know how THC worked. And they were able to study this, right, despite the prohibition on research, by using a derivative of an already FDA-approved THC analog called Marinol. So for those of you who didn't quite catch that, I love to overemphasize the fact that in 1985, the FDA approved Marinol, a synthetic THC. And before anyone understood how it worked in the body, right? Because it wasn't until 1988 that researchers wanted to figure out why and how it worked. So they used a radio-tagged synthetic THC derivative, and the first cannabinoid receptor was revealed as THC locked into and unveiled this remarkably extensive receptor network that was heavily concentrated throughout the brain, but also proliferate throughout the body. By 1995, researchers had identified what we call the foundational components of the endocannabinoid system. I believe you learned all about those yesterday, including the two primary cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, and the primary endogenous human-made cannabinoids that work on those receptors, anandamide and 2-AG. All right, and in 1994, at least we get some admission of wrongdoing here. Nixon's chief domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman, gave an interview with Harper's Magazine in which he made it abundantly clear that the former president's draconian stance on drugs had little, if anything, to do with the concern for public health and well-being, certainly despite the incredible amount of science and research that was elucidating so much about this plant. And this guy was quoted as follows. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. Do you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Does this feel familiar? Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So again, we hear another echo throughout history, right? The use of cannabis as a tool to vilify and control the people who the powers that be perceive as a threat, right? And the use of cannabis as a tool to not serve the people, but to serve the narrow interests. In this case, it was political gain, right? Formerly, it was industrial enterprise. But in 1996, right, conflicting opinions, right, despite all these dueling ideologies, we saw the eruption of knowledge and awareness of the plant's medicinal value and medical utility. And, all of this grew worlds more complicated when legislation in several states directly contradicted federal laws and policies. California was the first state to legalize medical use in 1996 when voters approved Prop 215. And that made the possession and cultivation of cannabis legal under certain conditions, right? Those conditions were that patients and their primary caregivers first needed just the approval of a physician licensed in California to gain access. And then the likes of Alaska and Oregon and Washington swiftly followed California in legalizing 2 years later in 1998. And so it was against this backdrop, right? The backdrop of spreading cannabis legalization into and beyond the turn of the century here, that research on the endocannabinoid system continued, still ongoing today. We're regularly identifying additional key players in this system and really revealing that there is an even more intricate and powerful system, bigger and more robust than the ECS yet, which is the endocannabinoid dome. I also want to pause on this slide real quick to note that the federal government, as the Department of Health and Human Services, filed a patent cooperation treaty in 1999 describing cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants. This is patent number 6630507. And they noted that these cannabinoids were useful in the treatment of and prophylaxis of a wide variety of diseases, including ischemic diseases like heart attack and stroke, aging, inflammatory and autoimmune diseases, stroke and trauma, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and HIV dementia. This patent was formally filed with the USPTO in 2001 and awarded in 2003. It is now 2021. And we're still fighting for the merits of this plant as medicine. So what I really hope you recognize along with me here is that the Controlled Substances Act definition of a Schedule I drug, right, no medicinal value, high risk of abuse, highly addictive, right, carries, that the federal government is operating, right, in direct contradiction when they file a patent for the medical properties of the principal phytochemicals that define the nature of the plant in the first place. This is why we're here today, y'all. We have to know this history. We have to understand where we've come from so that we can properly contextualize the conversations we're having about this plant and how we regulate it and how we access it today, right? Because of this, right? While the science is very exciting, we have to recognize how controversial scientific advancement and commercial legalization is, right? I get it. It's romanticized. It's super sexy, but we still have significant unresolved social justice issues, right? Issues deeply embedded in the structural racism that the history of cannabis is so bound to. Remember, it started in 1619 with the first West African slaves touching ground in this continent, who were set immediately to work cultivating and harvesting hemp. In the 2013 ACLU report, they reminded us of a sobering fact, right? They released a study that revealed that Black people in the United States were up to 6 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis, despite white people using it at slightly higher rates. I like to stress that white people use it at slightly higher rates because we even whitewash that statistic. You will hear the statistic repeated time and time again that Black people are arrested at 4 times or 6 times the rate of white people, despite similar rates in usage. We like to gloss over the reality that white people do use it at slightly higher rates. It's all the truth, right? And a reality all but outright ignored in the world of hemp, right? We overly focus on social justice in the marijuana space, right? Forgetting that hemp is arguably the cannabis sector most indebted to Black in Indigenous lives, right? But speaking of which, 2014 saw Congress pass a farm bill. So this preceded the 2018 Farm Bill that authorized a wide range of federal agricultural programs, including granting states and universities, finally, again, the right to research hemp. And then the 28 Farm Bill did one better for hemp, right? It removed it entirely from the definition of marijuana, and as a result from the Controlled Substances Act, paving the way for the CBD hemp boom. The same year, hemp began to grow again at Mount Vernon, right, George Washington's historic estate, in partnership with the University of Virginia. And according to the director of horticulture at the estate, he's quoted to have said, "To bring this crop back, it just really helps complete our agricultural history." Right? I am quite curious about what version of their history they tell, and what history they are working to make up for. All right. Now, as we near the end of this history lesson, there is much hope that this decade will be meaningful, that it will bring meaningful federal cannabis policy reform. In 2020, the House passed both the Safe Banking Act and the MORE Act in an attempt to create safe harbor for businesses in good standing, very important for our equity operators. But also erect a taxation model, right? Taxation again, and to address the failed war on drugs through automatic expungements at the federal level and through community investment initiatives. Neither bill have made it through the Senate to date. And I know we're in this sort of comment period for the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act that was presented out of the Senate this month as well. So definitely submit comment to that, to the sponsoring offices, Schumer, Wyden, and Booker. All right, now this brings us to 2021, where we are now. My last count, this might be outdated, was that 36 states, 4 territories, and DC have legal medical programs, while 19 states, 2 territories, and the District of Columbia have legalized small amounts of cannabis for adult use. But despite this progress, this year saw some other sort of activities, behaviors, when the Mississippi Supreme Court overturned the will of its voters by throwing out medical legalization while simultaneously denying the appeal of a Black man named Alan Russell, serving life in prison for cannabis possession, right? The AMA supported this move in Mississippi, right? In direct contradiction to their earlier stance at the turn of the 20th century. Okay, so when the total U.S. economic impact from marijuana sales in 2021 is expected to reach $92 billion, right? It's projected to be more than 30% from last year. What can we infer here? For us at CHEM, at the Cannabis Health Equity Movement, this means that the history we tell ourselves can no longer omit its most important arc, right? That on stolen Indigenous land, Black labor, and then Latinx influence, remember, it was Mexican Americans who brought to us smokable cannabis forms that are dominating our adult use market today. They paved the way to a booming legal cannabis industry, right? While these same communities continue to pay the highest costs. So, as hemp and marijuana, better known as cannabis at large, are today hailed as the fastest growing and most profitable sectors in this country, it is overwhelmingly run by white men, falling very short of creating pathways for the restitution, reparation, and revitalization efforts our communities are owed, that our communities deserve, and that our communities very much need. And this is wrong, right? Because history not only admits to systemic guilt and unfair gains, it also reveals to us just how and who the legacy and first fruits of the cannabis industry truly belong. Right? I like to sum this arc up as follows. For centuries, on stolen Indigenous land, enslaved Black people grew cannabis, right? Cannabis cultivars that we understand today as hemp, right alongside cotton, producing commercial commodities that help make the United States of America a very wealthy country, right? But while it was once hailed a valued American cash crop, it was weaponized. It was weaponized against communities of color, and our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities in particular, when just 6 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, We saw the 1970 Controlled Substances Act making cannabis possession illegal, right? Ushering in this sort of slavery 2.0 that is the prison industrial complex, right? This is a process that imprisoned breadwinners in our communities, imprisoned heads of households, and contributed to multi-generational divestment of our communities, right? And that has impacted all of our determinants of well-being, right? I'm a doctor, I'm a family medicine doctor at that, recognizing that it is the ecosystem that our communities are existing in that is making them sick, right? This slide shows that this process disrupted the nuclear family, perpetuated poverty, perpetuated mental health problems, sustained a prison pipeline for profit, perpetuated recidivism, right? We have the 3 strikes law. It has disenfranchised and justified the depletion of community resources. It's resulted in limited job opportunities, right? If you have a conviction on your record. It's stunted wealth building out of pace with the majority population, and has made patients of color fearful of using cannabis as medicine, right? So this is the landscape of global health disparity, especially in this country. And the major role cannabis prohibition has played has to be shared. We have to talk about it in order to be accounted for, right? I saw a presentation in Oregon out of the Oregon Health Authority on health equity in Oregon. Do you think they even covered the role that the war on drugs played in causing the very disparities we're trying to solve for? No, right? So for us at CHEM, when we consider all that cannabis can do for our health, its continued, albeit decelerating, prohibition is very ironic, right? And, for now, this slide will help us frame the negative impacts of prohibition on well-being a little differently than the slide before. This is a rubric that we use within CHEM. And on this slide are the 4 determinants of well-being. And they stratify well-being in this way because it allows us to better understand more tangibly the depth and totality of prohibition's effect on both individuals and communities, right? Because of that systemic oppression and racism that we just relearned about, reviewed, and this ongoing war on drugs, impacted communities have been denied this, right? They've been denied equitable access to well-being, which is created and maintained by the fair distribution, right? The just distribution of attention and investment across the 4 determinants of well-being. So, equitable access to well-being is how we simply coin health equity, right? And we have to ask ourselves, based on everything that cannabis is and can do, what do we want to achieve here as we legalize, as we set up systems and programs that govern this plant and how it's used and accessed, right? And this is where a new story begins. Okay, my mom always likes to say, we're still writing history, right? And with cannabis health equity as our North Star, well, we understand that we should be leveraging this unique opportunity, right, to direct the first fruits of the cannabis economy, right? How we're taxing and creating funds to put to work, and the utility of cannabis, right, in all of its varieties, its innovations to achieve health equity in the express effort to repair the communities harmed using cannabis as the harming tool of choice, right? We have an opportunity to flip the narrative on its head here, right? The history of cannabis tells a tale of mass exploitation and intergenerational harm to Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. So by our estimate, legalization should be healing our communities, right, at all costs. A month ago, we celebrated Juneteenth, right? It's now a national holiday. And, for me, I recognize that this holiday will forever remind me that none of us are free until we're all free, right? And so it also goes that until we care for our most marginalized, we cannot care for all people. So as you'll see in the next slide I have here, and I'm getting close to the end, is that through the ethos of cannabis, right, the goodwill of this plant, and its economy and innovations, cannabis is the right tool, right? It is uniquely the right tool to achieve this, right? I like to say that cannabis is the right investment tool in our prosperity. So from 25,000 reported uses back in 1938, right, with the magazine Popular Mechanics, to what we now believe is 50,000 uses in 2021. It's now understood that cannabis innovation spanning agriculture, industry, medicine, and even nutrition, right, and derived from one of the world's most sustainable plants, is a compound root solution to both medical and socio-ecological and economic disparities, right, plaguing our communities today, right? With the promise of such abundance, we cannot allow ongoing ongoing criminalization and deception around cannabis to remain the currency of our oppression, right? And we understand that the commercialization of cannabis right now can be the currency of our vitality. So from treating the health of our communities and economies to treating the health of our bodies and even our mindsets here, it is our cannabis health equity movement that sets out to ensure that this plant be used in every way to create transformational healing and advancement across those 4 pillars of health equity. And it's through, the leadership that we've cultivated through our coalition here, and you'll get to hear a lot more about this, that it's the true spirit of this plant, right? We are creating entourage benefit for our communities and each other when we take the time and have the courage to put all these pieces together. And on this slide, there's just a few of those 50,000, potential uses for cannabis. So you can see, you can infer, how each of these things could be used to address ecological problems, right, that are a root to our social disparities, right? All right, and then the cannabis health equity movement is our call, right, out to everyone to allow this plant to do what it was put on our earth to do. And in doing so, undoing the harms of its perversion, right? This plant is more than capable. It just needs empathic humans to steward its utility wisely and make our shared history the right way, right? We have a new history to write here. We call that the chem way. And as we start writing this history together, we do so by sharing knowledge, right? Advocating the truth, telling this history that I'm sharing with you today, participating in the process, right? Writing in to our Congress people, and making health equity our reason why, right? Because cannabis health equity doesn't just happen, right? This is living. It begins with our collective action and our ongoing attention, right? We have to remain vigilant and constantly correct inequities so that we can bring them back into balance, right? That's what the endocannabinoid system's role is, to maintain homeostasis and balance. This is what this plant can do for our society. All right. Well, with that, I welcome all into our movement. I call each of us into action to educate, advocate, and demonstrate that cannabis is a root solution to achieving health equity for all people. And that concludes my talk here. Thank you for your attention this afternoon. And I get to see you all again during our capsule a little bit later. All right, so it doesn't look like I received any questions, and that is okay. So I think that sums it up, folks. Thank you, Southern University Law Center, for having me on this fine day. And let's move on to the next.
So the next presenter I think that we have is Dr. Jessica Knox, who is going to be presenting next, followed by a panel discussion. Okay, everyone, we are going to resume at 2 o'clock. So if you want to take a break and then come back, our next presenter will be Dasheeda Dawson. Thank you. Okay, it is 2:00, and so our next presenter, Dasheeda Dawson, will be coming to the main stage as the presenter, and she'll introduce herself. Thank you all.
Okay, so gotta love technology. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. I'm struggling with internet in a new location, and it has not been fun because I need internet. Anyway, I am also taking a look in the chat for our tech support just in case I go out. But welcome to our next discussion, which is going to be around cannabis policy and equity. And we're going to talk about how we're reframing equity and boosting esteem. And of course, I will kick things off with sharing just a little bit about who I am. One of the best parts about working in coalition is what expertise we bring to the table. And so just a little bit more about my journey. I started off in the space as a cannabis patient. I am still a cannabis patient and advocate. Ultimately, I joined the space with my family. My sisters, Ice, Imani, Vida, and my aunt Latifa are shown in this picture. And we've been all over the country really teaching about cannabis as medicine. By and large, what we've learned is that most people don't really understand it because, as Dr. Rachel illuminated, it's been hidden from us in a significant way. But it is really important, especially for BIPOC communities, to understand the history. And so as a result, I have been to various conferences to teach and also wrote a book, How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry, which is an Amazon bestseller on how to get into the industry and make your way in a strategic way sense. It's a workbook. And of course, I am excited because it's everywhere now, and you can definitely find it not just in Amazon, but multiple places. Last but not least, you can hear from me weekly on She Blaze with my sister Ice. It's a weekly podcast where we share news, dish the dirt, talk real about the things happening in cannabis. And last but not least, you saw on the first slide that I am the cannabis czar. And so I am actually a regulator. So it looks like my slides aren't actually being shared. I noticed that with Dr. Rachel's presentation that I couldn't see her slides either. But I just want to make sure that everyone can see my slides. So let me just check out the chat. If you can see the slide, please just say in the audience chat that you do. That way, before I move on into the meat of this presentation, we don't have any tech issues. Audience sees my slides. Awesome. So yes, I am the cannabis czar. And so I'm bringing what I feel like is a very multifaceted approach to the cannabis space. It really truly is an intersection of cannabis, science, business, and policy. And ultimately, has led me to participate in the cannabis health equity movement because we need to demonstrate a little bit better and a lot better, let's be honest, how cannabis can actually be utilized in the space. Today, these are the learning objectives. We'll provide an overview of the cannabis legalization landscape and the current trends, talk about it, real talk, introduce the pillars of health equity, which Dr. Rachel did also review. It is something that we constantly are re-educating and reiterating because we think our definition of equity is very, very shallow and needs to be broadened. We'll be reframing the definition of social equity as a result in that discussion, and then highlighting the approach that cannabis equity leaders across the country are taking to achieve cannabis equity. And then last but not least, introduce CHEM, our global campus project, and our demonstration of cannabis health equity in action, how folks like you guys who are joining here and educating yourselves can really capitalize on the cannabis space. Awesome. Okay, so let's jump right into it. One of the things you probably already learned just as a result of looking at the Louisiana market, this is currently a trifurcated regulatory environment for cannabis. First and foremost, and I know this is being reiterated throughout, Dr. Rachel mentioned this as well, hemp is cannabis too. It's all part of the same genus. And it's one of those things that through the history being lost, it has been lost in the conversation. And so we are treating pretty much something that really should not be separated in this man-made way. We're treating it, pretty, I feel like, disrespectfully from a scientific perspective, the things that we could actually learn if we thought about it from a full spectrum. So when we look at the trifurcated regulatory environment, we're talking first about hemp, which, as Dr. Rachel alluded to, we had that farm bill that passed in 2018, and it effectively did legalize hemp. Now, granted, the farm bill was really brought to the table primarily by Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, which, just so you know, Kentucky is, considered to be the hemp capital of the country, with North Carolina as the Black hemp capital of the country. But the bill was really supposed to beef up grain and fiber. But instead, what has been a result of the bill passing in 2018, we're seeing a lot of hemp cannabinoid products, specifically around CBD, enter the market. And so these are the rules primarily that are focused on just hemp. Again, we have that less than 0.3% THC requirement. This is an arbitrary and not a scientific designation by any stretch of the imagination. There are cultivars that exist between 0.3% THC and 15, 17, 18% that we see in the marijuana market. We just don't generally cultivate them. This is also the case where we're seeing states legalize in a different way, reading the bill. Some states don't allow flower, like South Carolina, in the hemp space even. They're confused about how it looks just like marijuana. It has terpenes just like marijuana. And so it's very difficult to continue to arrest people and regulate if you can't tell the difference. And so as an easy way out, they just decided to ban flower altogether. The industrial research is done through USDA, and so they're the ones licensing state-approved licenses. And again, every state has an ability to really frame it the way that they want to. In New York, it's actually very easy, relatively, to get a hemp license. It's only $500 as opposed to like an enormous licensing fee for the medical market. And then, like I said, the cannabinoid consumer products, which, by the way, semi-fall under FDA, but we'll talk a little bit about why that is not actually the case and why there's still so much gray. But this is that hemp market. It's federally legalized. It presents the lowest barrier of entry if you're thinking about getting in from a business perspective. You can still be competent in cannabis as a hemp business owner, and you can still transition into high THC and or marijuana as a hemp business owner. But it's important to recognize that we are in a situation where it's still very much separate. And we'll talk about some of the dynamics of the science starting to really shake that up. The next is the medical marijuana market. And really, we differentiate this simply by the 0.3%. So, for example, Georgia just announced their licensees for their medical marijuana market, and it truly is a low THC medical marijuana market. It is an only oil medical marijuana market. Texas has a similar medical marijuana market as well. Until recently, as Louisiana has developed, you've seen that it has sort of transitioned from what we call sort of the hemp remix, when you have these very low THC level requirements or max, to a more accessible medical marijuana market. So again, the THC level will vary. Some will put caps and some will not. The lower level ones are like 1%, 3% caps, which, by the way, 1% is not to be scoffed at in terms of what it can do as compared to 0.3%, but it is, again, an artificially designated percentage of safety. These markets can be plus or minus flower, like Louisiana just passed a bill that will allow for flower. Florida started without flower as well. New York still does not have flower and will not until their adult use market gets fully into play. Oftentimes, these are vertically integrated markets. They are only really for people who can afford to go seed to solution, not just the dispensary or just the production and processing, or just the cultivation, all of it. And that makes it incredibly expensive. There's also usually a grandfathering in of access to adult use from the medical market. Essentially, you need to recognize that getting into the medical market actually makes for a very good advantage to transition into the adult use market. The penalties for possession are still existent, and oftentimes it really is, still a criminalization happening. So you have an ACLU report that came out in 2018 that shows that even in cases of medical marijuana passing, we are still seeing racial disparities in arrests, and in fact, worse as compared to 2010. And so we don't necessarily see legalization of medical cannabis as a real driver of any of the changes of the disparities with the incarceration and arrests. A lot of these programs do not include home grow, but many do. Oregon has a medical program that includes home grow, Oklahoma as well. And so this is just, again, an example of some of the differentiation. You will have states that have a hemp pathway for licensing, and you will have states that have a medical cannabis passing for licensing. As you think about the third part of this trifurcated regulatory framework for cannabis as a genus, the adult use cannabis market is what everybody kind of feels is the sexy. I'll tell you that is actually a big mistake, but nonetheless, let's talk about it. Adult use typically means over 21, although there have been states to introduce bills with 18 and older being the adult level. I believe that was Montana. Typically, adult use includes flower. We have not seen a market yet introduced that does not include flower in the adult use market, and that would make real dumb business move to not include flower, because it actually represents about 35 to 40% of legal markets right now. Most adult use markets have learned from the mistakes of the medical markets, because they usually open first a medical market, and they see that vertically integrated only, limited licensing is not the way to go. It's not going to have a diversified market, and oftentimes we have real homogenous product assortment. Basically, let's look at Minnesota, 3 licenses, all vertically integrated, 3 bankrupt businesses as a result of all 3 basically creating the same oil and seeing no conversion from the legacy market into the legal market. And so adult use really is that time where people fix it or use the excuse of having more revenue to be able to expand and fix it. So we see cultivation, processing, and manufacturing, distribution, and retail, but we also start seeing things like on-site consumption. And that doesn't mean that it's not something we should consider for medical. I think people automatically, again, have a lot of stigma and preconceived stereotypes about markets, and our bills and our laws are created based on that. So we believe, we want to have a party, so we need on-site consumption, as opposed to perhaps there are just medical patients that are in public housing, are unable to consume in their space, and therefore need a safe space to be able to consume their medicine. As you can see, it's slightly different in its perspective, but it does weigh itself in how legislators are dictating the law. On the federal level, and I apologize, this slide is a little bit busy because we've got a lot going on. We're going from criminalization to legalization, but I don't know if we're doing it necessarily with the history as the lens. And so part of what Cannabis Health Equity Movement is doing is we are reminding people, we are educating the people, the consumer, but we're also educating legislators and policymakers as well, because we're seeing a lot of mistakes when we look at the federal landscape. Based on what Dr. Rachel taught in the history, it is clear that the government has an accountability issue in terms of how it's treated this plant and the people associated with this plant over the last 100 years. And so it would make sense that the government would be required to repair that. And we'll talk about how that's happening or how we see best practices. But right now, the cannabis landscape is an interesting bag. For one, it's historical that we've ever had this many bills, so it tells you the popularity of it, but that doesn't mean that we will legalize anytime soon. The MORE Act of 2021 is the OG on the floors of Congress, because it is now I would say its third iteration. It already has had a historic passage last year with the MORE Act of 2020, and it removes THC from controlled substances. It expunges federal cannabis convictions, and it establishes an Opportunity and Justice Office that's specifically designed to lead and manage programs and funds from the cannabis tax revenue that are intended to go back to the communities that were most harmed. The Senate just introduced a historic bill that was co-sponsored by Schumer, Booker, and Wyden. It's the first time we're seeing a real look at a bill in the Senate, primarily because it's been Mitch McConnell's Senate for a long time. And so, no, it wasn't even getting out of committee. And so in this case, with Schumer being the majority leader, it bypasses committee. It goes directly to the floor. But first, they have released a discussion draft that's requesting public input until September 1st and a little bit beyond. But September 1st is really when you want to impact that bill. It expunges federal cannabis convictions also. It authorizes, however, a little bit more deeply the FDA and the Alcohol and Tobacco Taxation Bureau to really regulate cannabis. And then the biggest thing that stands out to me, even though it's really supposed to be centered in equity, right now it's a bit of a shell. It's a marketing plan in equity. And what's actually in the bill is a quite punitive tax structure that would not be good for both small businesses or BIPOC businesses that are entering or currently in the space. It also doesn't account for the current businesses, especially those operating in a medical landscape. So we've still got a lot of work to do. It's important. You can expect that we will be commenting for CHEM, but just know that those two bills being active in Congress right now is truly a historical moment, because theoretically, and I don't believe it will happen, but theoretically, it means that we are at least in a path that could have a bill that could reach the Biden desk. But unfortunately for us, one, these are far from done, but also as soon as the Senate bill was released, Biden's team immediately responded, we won't say less than 2 hours later, basically saying that it doesn't matter because they're not still supporting a legalization bill. So we still got work to do. Right now, floating around as sort of the backup, which we, holistically refute as equity, is the Safe Banking Act. It provides access to banking, and this is much needed. Small businesses in the cannabis space in particular are the most vulnerable to the fact that there's no banking. However, this bill is not centered in equity or justice, and it removes barriers of entry right now that are preventing big industries from really coming in. And by that, I mean big pharma, big tobacco. While they might not risk their actual entities themselves until there's a full federal legalization, for a multi-billion with a B dollar company making a multi-million-dollar investment in a smaller company or effort is a reasonable thing to do once banking is allowed, as long as they feel like they can protect the money. So in some ways, this is a little bit of a risk, but we've heard from Booker and Schumer that they will not support Safe Banking Act because essentially it frees the paper, the money, before it frees the people. How do we allow for more banking and more access from the people that have privilege to access the industry now without first expunging all of the convictions and resentencing all of the convictions? It again goes back to a government accountability. And one of those things that we are using to really compel legislators to rethink how quickly they want to legalize. We also have the Hemp Access and Consumer Safety Act. This goes back to the hemp trifurcated slide I showed, where hemp, instead of it being grain, which is basically seed, and fiber, which is the stalk, neither of which have much cannabinoid concentration, we've seen more growing for the flower of hemp, which is the cannabinoid rich area of hemp. And that's opposite of what the Hemp Farm Bill was supposed to do. And And as a result, FDA wasn't prepared. They essentially ignored the fact that they're supposed to really regulate CBD. It's been very arbitrary. Some cease and desist did get sent out to really, really big CBD companies like Charlotte's Web in the industry, what we call legacy companies that started with the medical marijuana and saw the opportunity with CBD. They got cease and desist, but we haven't really had much guidance from the FDA perspective. And as a result, it's a hot mess, and we'll talk about it. But this is a bill that's supposed to compel them to actually do their job. I'm a government official, so I definitely paused when I read this, because I'm like, why do we need a law to make the FDA do what they're supposed to do? But this is why it's so important for us to pay attention. And last but not least, this is more on the nay side of cannabis, is perpetuating the same old, welfare for needs, not weed. And that is the real name of the bill. It was introduced by two Republican representatives that don't even have a medical marijuana program, I might add, and essentially intends to block low-income individuals from using their TANF funds for cannabis. It ignores cannabis as medicine fundamentally, and that patent that the U.S. Health and Human Services actually holds, it ignores it and ultimately perpetuates the stigmas. They essentially want to categorize cannabis with liquor and the strip club and all these other things that are vices, not recognizing that there are millions and millions, I happen to be one of them, of individuals that need cannabis as medicine, and probably millions and millions, many more, that do not recognize they do and have yet to make that transition. And this is because, by and large, we're seeing that our laws are based on two phytocannabinoids. And so if you sat through pharmacology and endocannabinoid system, you should not be surprised to see these. But THC and CBD are the real showstoppers. Although we know, and happen to be a molecular biologist, we know that these molecules are not the only ones. There's hundreds of cannabinoids. There's also the terpenes, flavonoids, and amazing things that build up plant material that are actually good for our bodies, but we only focus on these two, probably due to the history of the criminalization. THC is, again, what we know to be the high of cannabis, euphoric, some would say intoxicating, some would say actually that's not scientifically correct word, but the key thing is that is the main decider of hemp, right? Hemp is 0.3% THC. Anything above that is what we call hot hemp, or anything above that is really technically marijuana by definition of the in the law. Delta 9 is really what's being controlled here versus other THC isomers. And of course, it's a bit of a mess. Folks have probably already heard about Delta 8, which can be synthetically made from isolate CBD, or it can be made from Delta 9, pretty much degrading over time, which actually just sounds like bad weed. I don't know, but I'm sure that there are real benefits of Delta 8. The problem is we are following the capitalism with our law as opposed to following the science. And so really wanting us to take a step back is the trend here. But Delta 9 versus other THC isomers are always going to be sort of in conversation as long as we are, again, regulating by compound. CBD is the star of hemp and has become, the big thing, the real medicine. We have a lot right now going on in conversations around the Olympics with CBD, with Megan Rapinoe and her sister's business versus the THC that was consumed by Sha'Carri Richardson. It's all one plant. We kind of continue to say that. I'm going to sing that because without really that entourage benefit, CBD is not nearly as effective as it could be, or THC is not nearly as effective as it could be. And so it's always a disservice to kind of see how it gets pitted against each other. But it's also psychoactive, and it has currently no legal limits, although it probably should. And again, it isn't the only cannabinoid. Right now, we really are seeing ourselves step up. We have people like Dr. Rachel Knox, who's one of the first medical doctors to become part of a regulatory commission. That needs to happen more versus enforcement, law enforcement being the leaders of that commission. I have a science background as well and a business background, so it makes it, again, a different perspective as we look at the regulation. And for us, science will eventually influence the law and policy, so you should definitely build your business around that. that, there are definitely going to be what people are calling the minor cannabinoids that show up and are starting to become very important in both product, but also just understanding our entire endocannabinoid system and what works best to improve our bodies. As you've seen with Dr. Rachel's earlier slide, there's so many usages, and we're just not actually getting there in any fast fashion. We're still very limited across agricultural, industrial, medical, and nutritional. And I think a lot of that has to do with our trifurcated regulatory system. Also, what we're recognizing more and more is that we're not isolated in the United States in our attempt to really understand what cannabis can do. This is a global impact that cannabis is having. We as a movement are talking to both Caribbean and African contexts to continue to build education and capacity for them to also capitalize on cannabis health equity. So there are opportunities in all different areas for us to participate. But what I will say is that the government right now is certainly not doing its best to participate or lead the way. By and large, they should be, given the criminalization. So we kind of, again, continue to reiterate that history because it gets lost on us very quickly. We, some people smell weed right away and they immediately go to a very clear conditioning on what they think. And I want for everyone, when you hear the word cannabis, if you leave the symposium, nothing else, you recognize what happened to Black and brown communities as a result of intentional criminalization with a racial bias lens in terms of enforcement. And as a result, I want everyone to leave with understanding that if the government did that, then the government is required to use legalization laws and regulations to remediate every aspect of cannabis prohibition. And as we said, when we think about social equity, we're thinking well beyond just a program to get a license. And I think that that's important for the industry for sure. But as Dr. Rachel pointed out more eloquently, I think that I would, there are pillars here, and this is our foundation as a cannabis health equity movement. For me, I think it's so important to recognize that whenever we're talking about giving a license, and we're talking about economic equity, but using the new industry as a vehicle. But let's be real, there are so many other emerging industries that can help build economic equity. The other thing that is so important to call out is the community's ability to have that collective agency with their economics, just the resources. And if I go back to East New York, where I'm from, which is the hood, at one point the murder capital of the country, I know that there are community leaders that know firsthand that we have not had that collective agency, both personally as well as collective, to be honest. We've not had that in those communities. We've also had, a lack of environmental equity. Let's just think about Flint, Michigan, which is still right now struggling with yellow water. But there's this, again, this need for us to address not just the money and the economic, but what does our environmental look like? Where are we sending people home to? How do we live with our children and our families? And is it in a clean, natural space? The fact of the matter is, for most urban and rural areas that I've been in, even in states that have legalized cannabis, they have significant issues to overcome in the sense of environmental, and these are not being addressed with cannabis equity at all. Then, of course, we have the human equity again, and thinking about this is a lot broader than what we've seen as described as health equity. I, feel like we're talking about health equity as a buzzword, and right now it's talking about equity in healthcare, and we need that. And when we talk about equity in healthcare, we're primarily talking about physical healthcare, but we actually think of this pillar inclusive of physical, mental, and spiritual. And I think especially as people of color and Indigenous folks, the mental and the spiritual is something that we are often not given license to have healthcare for that. And so this is one of those, again, eye-opening pillars for me, that beyond just the physical, we need a full spectrum view at everything that impacts our health, and that would be mental and spiritual, but also our knowledge and skills and what makes us who we are, our empathy, the education that happens in our communities. All of those things are things that need to be more equitable. And in my experience working in the government, I have found found that no one is talking about these other three pillars, maybe as one-offs, but not in this collective sense. And certainly when they talk about social equity, they are not talking about it as fairness in policy, regardless of what policy, regulation and distribution of the resources, and fairness and assurance that, everyone has impartial and continual access to these other three pillars. We're not talking about that at all. And so for me, I'm constantly reiterating that, again, social equity is not going to be just a program. It shouldn't be relegated to the new affirmative action. It is actually our vehicle. It's our tool that we need to use to be able to achieve this other, these other equity pillars in order for us to get to total equity. So with that being said, as we've said, and we constantly say, you hear it as a mantra, social equity is the vehicle, health equity is our destination. And again, when we think about it, we're not just talking about in our individual one-off communities. That is important, and we should start there. But we're talking about a global impact across ag, industrial, medical, and nutritional with that total equity lens. So how are we getting there? The fact of the matter is, I don't necessarily know that people are thinking about it with this much level of detail. And I think our experiences in the industry as a collective coalition has shown that we've tried many different pathways, and it's not achieving the goals that we really need to see. We're not repairing the harm. In some cases, we're not ending the harm either. And so what I like to share is a three-pronged approach to achieving cannabis health equity or cannabis equity in general. And it's really developed out of the work that Dr. Rachel and I have done with the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. And I always give credit to Kat Packer, who's the executive director for the LA Department of Cannabis, because it was her initial framework that we've sort of built out. But the first is we want to end the harm, right? So when we talk about all of those pillars, I gave a couple of examples where, we haven't had economic license and agency for most people of color. That ability to do that is limited. Environmentally, we still struggle with the capabilities of being able to live someplace that's actually good for our health. From a human equity perspective, by and large, education has been disinvested in our communities, and we barely are keeping up with the physical health care, let alone being included in mental and spiritual. And so this is why it's so important to talk about why we have to have an approach. So to end this harm that we see still continuing in states that are even ones that are legalized, it must include expungement and pardons and that post-supervision relief. Someone coming out of or being released or in probation or parole, they also have some collateral consequences as a result of cannabis use. Those things need to go away. If we're saying cannabis is medicine first, because again, government has a patent on it, so that's not disputable. And then we're saying second, that we shouldn't have criminalized it because the history is racially biased in its intent, and we need to rectify that. Then the first thing is to understand that we now have to treat people who we have criminalized a lot differently. And that means going into the crevices of our policy, our bad policy, and ensuring that we're removing the things that cannabis has been used to basically discriminate against people who are already struggling because they have cannabis criminalization. We need reentry support. That means dollars specifically for these individuals and figuring out where are they going to be able to move and transition next in life. Clearing collateral consequences, like I said, in policy is so important. And then last but not least, the decriminalization piece of it. I think that it's still criminalized when you are saying, okay, I hope I have, I hope they know what 3 ounces looks like. I hope they know what an ounce looks like. Every time we legalize with the personal possession limit on you being an ounce, I get infuriated. One, because I know I would be criminalized as a result of what I carry on myself as a patient. But two, it's not based in science. So decriminalization is really truly letting go of these limits of what people can carry or do, with cannabis, understanding that it is a plant and that not everyone and the vast majority of people criminalized, 90%, it was based on possession and not a distribution intent. But at the bare minimum, when we talk about ending it, we have to expunge. So if you're fighting policy and you're becoming an advocate in your jurisdiction, just be aware that these other things may take some time, but there are some things that we hold the line on, and there's no reason expungement should not be part of a cannabis legalization framework. As we go into repairing the harm, we're talking about taking cannabis tax revenue, especially, to figure out how this newfound revenue for government can actually be invested in a way that get a return on equity, right? We invest money in certain ways to supposedly improve our communities, but in this case, we're really being intentional about return on equity, specifically as it pertains to cannabis. That means addressing and prioritizing those communities that are most harmed. It also means managing this money like a diverse investment. As a businesswoman, I still am very shocked coming to the public sector to see no interest bared on $1 million sitting in the bank in the government. So we have to demand that in some ways. We actually have to see that in legislation, in fact. And so it's important for us to, again, start using terms like return on equity investment. How are we doing? What's the accountability? At least include that in the legislation so it sounds like we care about it working, which right now is sort of we're saying it, but there's no key performance indicators, as I guess I would say. We also need to prioritize licensing for individuals that were specifically targeted and criminalized. In the past 25 years that cannabis has been legal, most of the time, people who have a previous conviction have been kept out. Can you imagine? We have to fix that, but then we also have to ensure that we recognize that if they were the ones criminalized, they should be the first to the well of this newfound source of money. Business incubation is going to be really important when we're repairing, because again, if we're trying to get people to participate in the industry, if we're trying to get people to build even services for these communities as part of community reinvestment, it's all business, whether it's a nonprofit business or a for-profit business, it's all business. And so we'll need our support, technical support for our community, because a lot of that has also not been afforded to us, typically been out of range or expensive and unable to really get as much when you're an entrepreneur of color. But again, when I talk about that check mark, I'm looking at a baseline. What will I not walk away? What will I say has to happen? Community investment. All these other things, I think we can have discussion, but when you have multi-billion dollars coming into the state, it should not go into a general fund. It should not be going to the police bureau, which, by the way, for most states, that is a large percentage of their funds. Budget, it should be actually very clearly tracked, and we should see community investment. And as a result of starting to prevent further harm, we need those accountability systems in place to ensure that we're measuring, monitoring, and reporting. We're having data sharing, because truthfully, that's what I feel like is missing. As a regulator, I'm in a silo for my jurisdiction, but what happens in Louisiana, what happens in New York, what happens in other countries matters. It's precedent. And the more that we share that information, the better our legalization and our policy making will be. And at the regulatory level, you can change policy a lot faster than you can actually change legislation. So, when it's in the statute, and we talk a little bit about some things you don't want in the statute, but when it's in the statute, hands are tied if you're a regulator. But if you are able to learn about different ways policies can impact the health of your industry, and that includes not just licensing and compliance health, but the education and equity health of your actual industry, then you know that it's time to probably change the laws if it's impacting that health. Public re-education is important. I work every day with people who determine our lives in the city of Portland. And sometimes it's so scary how much canophobia there is, or a real misinformation around the truth around cannabis. We need more representation in policy. By that, Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition was really formed for that purpose, because we didn't have enough of us. And now we actually do have more and more coming to the table. And it happens, not by chance, to coincide with how quickly cannabis equity as a conversation is starting to dominate the regulatory conversation. Last but not least, labor agreements is something that we saw in the Connecticut legalization bill that just passed. And it's something that is becoming more and more a discussion point, because when I look at some of the work done in Oregon, Cannabis Workers Coalition, they've done surveys where, people are being mistreated because nobody is also watching these operators and how they're treating people who are working. And in the case of the cannabis space, while we don't have a lot of ownership among BIPOC within the industry, we do still represent a good enough percentage of the workers, and in some cases, a majority. So it's an example, again, of we are fighting for a lot of laws that benefit the owners, which still don't include Black and brown individuals, and negating the people who are working. So labor agreements are really, really important. Above all, if you're trying to really get this done, accountability systems are required. If you're not really trying to have an oversight board, if you're not trying to have some sort of recurring reporting, then it tells me that you don't really care to optimize and improve. In the business world that I came from, the Targets of the world, Victoria's Secret, it is impossible to start anything new, pilot anything, and not be consistently going back to senior leadership to explain how we're doing, what we're changing, how we're improving going forward. This is the job. And so just again, encouraging the accountability systems. It's time also for you guys to get involved. So the last part of my lecture today will really focus on what we've been doing as a cannabis health equity movement before we transition into our power panel of experts to share a little bit more of their experiences within CHEM. But again, like I said, for us, it is about how do we take our pillars, overlay it with the work that needs to be done across revitalization, public and private sector, building infrastructure, data policy, and regulations. And it really is a complexly integrated world. And as a strategist, it's an exciting world for me because we are so powerful when we work in this way. And what I also recognize being a consultant in the space is that many other communities have already started working this way. Having consulted with some Native American tribes, this is one of the key things that I actually learned that they've been doing as well. And again, could also improve. So the first is to educate yourself. So you're here, you learn the history, you learn the science. If you don't learn anything else but just those two things, you're already starting off in a much better position to be an advocate, or to be a business owner, be an investor, or to be a patient, if that is what you need. You need to also take what you learn and, educate it forward. At this point, you're hearing us repeat the CHEM pillars of equity. You're hearing us repeat social equity is the vehicle and health equity is the destination. And so repeat those things, because that's how we get a chorus, and that's how we build momentum. Share the truth and dismantle the stigma. That's one of the main reasons why I came out as a cannabis patient. I'm probably one of the only regulators that is openly a cannabis patient, and I think it's important for people to see faces and see excellence and start to dismantle this stigma that being a patient somehow means you are degenerate. The next is we need you to participate. So some folks are here because they want to be in seed to solution. You want a license, you're trying to learn more, or you want to support as an ancillary business your clients that have licenses. But either way, you need to participate, but don't jump to participate before educate and advocate, because you will run into barriers. And so that's why the steps are important. And last but not least, demonstrating. That's what we're doing with cannabis health equity movement, is we're building coalition, because the government is very risk averse. They will never, ever be the demonstrator, right? It will always come from a private sector entity, but it can be done in private-public partnership, because there are governments and there are regulators that want to do it, but because of risk aversion, they have to show and prove that it's been done before they can roll it out. So it's just important that as you're doing work in your community and your jurisdiction, continue to demonstrate what you think should be best practices in the space. So while social equity is the vehicle, health equity is the destination, we know that cannabis is a core solution. And for us, this is about how we activate. And this is what gets me excited. Even though I can be extremely tired day to day, I feel being part of the coalition has ignited an overdrive in a way that keeps me continually inspired and really pretty gangster. I think we fuel each other's gangster, and we need that in this space. But everything that we're doing is rooted in scientific fact. And everything that we're looking towards is about achieving health equity for all. And so it's just important to be clear on why we're working in coalition. And the coalition is growing. And so let's start with ACHEM, or our Association for Cannabis Health Equity and Medicine. This is our 501c6 nonprofit mutual benefit professional medical association for BIPOC healthcare professionals and students. It's actually the first in the country, maybe even the world, that is specifically geared towards BIPOC health professionals and healers. And you get to learn from the best. But again, this programming as part of CHEM is really intended to tackle what we feel like is missing and has been missing since California legalized in 1996, which is the inclusion of our health professionals. If cannabis is medicine and we all have an endocannabinoid system, you might not be one to smoke, but you do have a right to know how your endocannabinoid system works and how you might be able to better achieve your health as a result of modulation. And you need your doctors to know that too. You need your health professionals to know that too. And it's all very holistic. And as a patient who has a scientific background, I personally have been very frustrated not having an ability to have real conversations with health professionals about real ailments that I have with early signs of MS. It's really been frustrating. And so I'm excited about ACHEM. That is our core, because for us, again, cannabis is medicine first and always. And everything that we're doing really stems from understanding that first. And so I appreciate that effort. We also have our CHEM Alliance, and this is our 501c3 where we offer curricula and events, and we're focused on community enrichment and corporate competency, which is a must. This is the area where we really focus as well on public-private partnerships as we bring projects like the CHEM Global Campus to life and health equity certification. And then all of this behind the scenes is really driven by just an amazing coalition of integrated business owners, our network of cannabis leaders. We have expertise across many different areas, from medicine, law, research, and regulation, and more. And we are working very, very intentionally to ensure that we can develop curriculum and build the next wave of cannabis leaders and under a different education and under a different light. And so I'm super excited just to share the last part of what we're doing. And of course, Southern University Law Center being our inaugural CHEM institution partner, but launching the CHEM Global Campus has been sort of a very important dream of mine since ideating concepts of this for large private equity firms that wanted licenses. What I recognize is that, and I think CHEM as a whole, we all do, is that we're not necessarily going to see it built the way we need it unless we build it ourselves. And so that is what we're doing with the CHEM Global Campus. Our objectives are really threefold. We want to boost STEAM, and STEAM being our trademark curriculum that focuses on a multidisciplinary approach to cannabis. Cannabis is actually making everything sexy again, even social justice, which is why you got some legislators now talking about social justice when they never did. It's funny how that is sometimes. But to be perfectly honest, is actually making sciences very, very sexy again. I never thought I would be able to have a fun conversation about molecular biology with my son, who's 17. But I have, and it's because I can talk about the molecules of cannabis, and he's totally interested. But the point being is that cannabis can be used to really fuel a boost in that curriculum, drive enrollment rates. You know, the people who are interested in this space are becoming, again, they're younger and younger. They are the next generation, and you can set yourself apart as an institution by offering symposiums like this one, offering curriculum that really touches on this developing industry. The other goal is to establish experiential learning. Like, We can learn how we're doing now on slides, and this information is so powerful. So I don't want to negate that. And in fact, it's so powerful that I think you should do it before you touch the plant. I think it changes your whole perspective when you walk into your first nursery or your first dispensary or your first greenhouse. It changes. You don't see how high with Method Man and Red Man. I use that as my reference because that's my age group, but that's not what I see anymore. I see opportunity. I see medicine, and I see a disenfranchised plant and people that have used it. And so I think, again, having the education beforehand and then adding the hands-on is the way we prepare people for success entering the market. We want it to translate to tangible work experience, but work experience where you don't just join like a droid, right? And you just follow the bud tender saying something that's crazy, but work experience where you come in and you can be intentional. You can actually be an expert around cannabinoid science and or products. Just understanding it better from a total landscape will make you a better candidate. We also think we want to, use this to restore our underperforming communities. We see this through the opportunity to do land revitalization projects. How many underutilized pieces of land exist in our families that now, I am always encouraging they should probably be looking at hemp if they can. And we'll talk about that. We have our agronomists on the panel and, of course, hemp entrepreneurs as well. So that might be of interest. But this is something that could be done by the government now, but it's not been. It has to be, again, through private-public partnerships. And again, that's our goal, is to help contribute to that, help contribute to those projects, entrepreneurship, and the job creation that comes with this type of revitalization. We're super thrilled to include Southern University Law Center, of course, as our inaugural partner. And that's why we're here. That's why we created this CHEM Capsule, to be able to demonstrate some of that work we're doing together to, again, expand, enhance, and amplify our expertise, both on the ground and in the classroom. Our campus is really, at a glance, again, boosting esteem. It's a lot of parts and it depends on the campus. But one of the things I want to encourage people to do is, if you have an alma mater that you're interested in bringing this is the time to reach out and let us know. But also, if you're interested in participating as a CHEM Coalition member, these are the areas that we're going to be pulling from our coalition expertise. Curriculum development, we have a CHEM Institution Consortium, which we kicked off back in April. We'll have our next one coming up in October. It's actually a semi-annual summit. We have expungement and legal clinics, research and development, a BIPOC farmers cooperative, cannabis workforce training, business incubators, health disparity research, health policy. And of course, we are always looking for funding, and we're primarily doing so through the federal grant and foundational grant space, but we also have corporate partnerships. And so if you have expertise at all in any of these areas, these are the things that we feel like we can do best in coalition, in paid coalition, as a businesswoman. So with that being said, I am just so thrilled that we were able to participate. I'm super excited for you guys to get to know more about CHEM with our next panel. And I'm going to encourage you guys to all join the movement. We can't do it individually. And even though we may have our individual businesses and interests, at the end of the day, if we're going to really see impact, not just here, but across the diaspora, we're going to have to work in intentional, strategic coalition. And so I invite you guys to join us. Thank you and bye. I think we're moving to the next thing.
Thank you all for joining us. We will get started again at 3 o'clock with our panel discussion. So please take a break and we'll see you back at 3 o'clock. Thank you. Hello. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us at 3:00 at the top of the hour. We have our lovely panel that's about to start. I'll let you all introduce yourselves. Take it away. I think you might be on mute, John. I can't hear you. Say something. I still can't. Can anyone else hear him?
No.
Okay.
No, I can't hear him.
Maybe you can.
John, check the volume on your mute button on your keyboard as well as in the app. We still don't have you.
Can you check your sound preferences too? It might be on 0, even though it's not on mute. So we can give you a few minutes to log out and then log back in, and that may help. And then in the meantime, Dr. Jessica, Dr. Rachel, and Ms. Coleman can introduce themselves, well, reintroduce themselves to the audience.
Sure. I guess I'll get started. Hello again, everybody. I am Dr. Jessica Knox. I spoke to you all yesterday about cannabis pharmacology and the science of how cannabis works. And I am pleased to be back with you today to be on this. I like how Dasheeda termed it, this power panel representing the CHEM Coalition. I am one of the physicians representing ACHEM, our Association for Cannabis Health Equity and Medicine. So yeah, pleased to be here again with you. Pass it to you, Faye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jessica. I know we have a couple Dr. Knoxes, so pardon the familiarity. And I'm so excited to be part of this power panel today with such esteemed leaders in the space. Just a little bit about myself. I began my career as an engineer in the food industry. Kraft General Foods, Campbell Soup is what brought me to New Jersey. I then went into retail, leading store operations for the tri-state area for Target. That's where myself and Dasheeda initially connected. Then I moved forward with CVS as a market leader before transitioning into cannabis in 2018. My reasons were not purely business. I was motivated as I am a cancer survivor, and I was looking for really at cannabis as an alternative medicine. So a little bit about my company, which is Pure Genesis, or PG. We're a certified minority women business enterprise, cannabis business, with over 250 years of experience in supply chain, IT, retail, pharmacy, HR, and cultivation. We continue to expand our positive reach by fulfilling our mission of education, access, and advocacy. And our strategy is very simple. We look to cultivate, process, and dispense cannabis in all forms. Our focus is to serve as a business through community-first partnering by offering 30% of our jobs to those who have been released from prison due to small possession, by providing transferable and leadership skills training, offering a living wage and 1% profit sharing in the communities where we reside. We have 6 business streams where we are focused on acquiring a cannabis license. We are also multi-state hemp operators. We are working with Rowan University on a data analytics study on pain management. We serve as business and education consultants, where we are proudly part of the CHEM Coalition. We also conduct education workshops for at-risk youth, and we have a line of CBD beverages called Genesis that we are launching in August. Again, great to be here.
But can everybody hear me? Just doing a sound check here. Awesome. Perfect. Ladies, I want you to know that I'm giving space. Dr. Jessica and Dr. Rachel, you guys can duke it out about who goes next.
Doctor just went while you were gone. So just So hello again, everyone. I gave a very brief introduction during the Essential History of Cannabis presentation because we had to get right to the good stuff. But I am Dr. Jess' big sis. I guess it's me who coined myself DK3, Dr. Knox number 3, because my parents are 1 and 2. Not that cute now that I say it out loud. But as I'm sure Jess might have mentioned yesterday, we're a family of 4 physicians who just were enthralled by the history that I was able to share with you today, because we were doubly, if not triply, just galvanized to lead in this space as Black women physicians. I will say it was very, very frustrating to learn this history, knowing that on the one hand, as a doctor, I was deprived knowledge that could have helped make significant impacts in the patients' lives that, I was seeing, and for whom I only had a few conventional tools in my tool belt to attempt to help. And just understanding the number of lives that have been impacted because of the withholding of cannabis medicine. But then understanding, golly, that this plant had been weaponized against also the communities that I was educated to serve, right? In residency, my primary patient demographic in North Carolina were Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people. So that is what inspired me to be involved in policy and regulation. So as I mentioned, I chaired the Oregon Cannabis Commission for 3 years. I felt it was very important that health and medical professionals who understood the pharmacology and the physiology and helped inform policies that impact a commercial industry that people with endocannabinoid systems are accessing for products. I serve the city of Portland. I get to work with Dasheeda on the cannabis policy oversight team. I'm a founding member of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, founding board member of Minority Cannabis Business Association, continue to serve the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, you get the theme, and have been excited to help align with other folks. We're not in CHEM Coalition, but who are by default in coalition in this space as we inform federal regulation. So I've gotten to sit on a couple federal cannabis regulation work groups as we try to properly inform our Congress people. So yeah, I will just close my little intro here in saying that I'm very fortunate to be in this space with my family. Very fortunate to have enlarged my family through CHEM Coalition. We, like Dasheeda said, we welcome you into coalition with us, and because we are a family, right? We have a lot of work to do to heal our communities, and yeah, let's get going, John.
Awesome. I'm also helping Travell troubleshoot on the back end here a little bit as well. Again, for everyone that I have not had the opportunity to meet and speak with yet on the virtual screen, my name is John Alston, and I am a Louisiana native. I am also a Southern University alumni. I graduated from Southern University with a mechanical engineering degree and commissioned into the United States Navy as a pilot. After my career, I spent some time putting that engineering degree to work in manufacturing, various engineering applications. I'm also a Six Sigma black belt and everything, trained by Whirlpool after doing some time with them, actually prior to getting in the cannabis industry. And I came to the cannabis industry after a breast cancer scare with my mother. I didn't want her to endure kind of like the harshness of chemotherapy and those things. And so I watched my best friend of like 35 go through that experience. And with that and everything, I will tell you guys that I was just scared to death. And so I really went into the cannabis research, the limited amount of information that was available on the internet, any books that I could find on Amazon. And so I had this real conversation with my mother to the point where I believed in it so much because it told a very unique story about how our governments and how our policies influence the criminalization of our Black and brown communities down to our core. And being an HBCU graduate and everything, it just really spoke to me not only on the social justice scale, but also I figured the cannabis industry was the next Apple and Microsoft that I asked my parents, why didn't you guys get in on that so we could like be rich and like living next to Fresh Prince and Bel-Air and something like that, you know? But that's kind of my entryway into the cannabis industry. And I want you guys to know I'm very honored to have the opportunity to speak with you guys and share. I'm very honored to sit next to these brilliant women that you see on this screen right now. These ladies are just absolutely whooping tail and taking names in these industries. And the fact that they are coming about it with as much knowledge and compassion that they have, not only for the consumers and for the patients, but also for the entrepreneurs out there and the other Black and brown individuals that are just really trying to hit the road and make something for themselves and for their families, just like the American dream that, you know, we're often sold, but often not a big part of, right? So if nothing else, let that be the fuel and the fire to drive your interest in this industry. So as a CHEM member and as a coalition leader and everything, I have to admit that this conversation is just very exciting to me because the chats have been going crazy the entire time in these lectures about what is CHEM, who is CHEM. And so I'm going to start the panel discussion and just ask you ladies, can you explain to the audience what CHEM is? What is the Cannabis Health Equity Movement and what are we doing out there in these streets?
That's all you, Dr. H.
Gotta get myself on mute here. All right, so repetition is key. You know, CHEM Coalition, as Dasheeda said, is our effort to educate, advocate, and demonstrate how we can leverage cannabis, like I said earlier, through its economy, through its taxation, through its policy and regulation, and through its innovations to achieve equitable access to well-being. And in doing so, it is intentional that we begin doing the work in the communities that have been most divested of that equitable access to well-being. In our country, it is the data is clear. That is our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. Ironically, these are the communities that have been targeted by cannabis prohibition and in that order. And these are the communities, like I also said in my presentation, that cultivated cannabis as we know it in the United States today in the first place, right? We know that enslaved Black people cultivated hemp on stolen indigenous land, and it was our Mexican, Americans who taught us how to inhale. So for those of us in the equity space for all these years, it has just grown so frustrating to witness the mismanagement of social equity. And amongst a legalization rubric that by all intents and purposes is just widening the divide. We also know that within our communities, within our stakeholder group, we represent some of the brightest in the cannabis space. So who is better equipped than us to give our communities what they need? There is no one better. So, CHEM, the movement was birthed, almost 2 years ago now. Y'all, I still need to NFT this, but this is the sticky note on which I wrote Cannabis Health Equity Movement, trying to figure out what we're going to call this. CHEM for short, September 2019. And, those that were already in my circle and I would ruminate on the efforts being done to date. And we just started meeting up as individuals with our own personal interests in the industry, but with a common mission and a common goal, and decided that we were going to demonstrate what this cannabis plant and the endogenous cannabinoid system teach us, in that the outcomes that we want to achieve are going to require synergy, right? And when we work together collaboratively, we will make an impact that is greater than the sum of our parts. That is the essence of the entourage effect of this plant as it hits our endogenous cannabinoid system in our body, right? People like to talk about the entourage effect. I got terpenes in my product or whatever, but it's directly applicable to the work that we do together to enrich ourselves, right? To fill up so that we can pour out into our communities and really steward this industry appropriately. So yeah, I mean, understand that this coalition has to continue to grow so that each and every one of us have an opportunity to share in the impact, right? To share in creating the changes that we want to see in our cannabis world. So I hope that answered the question.
Magnificently. And it's always great to hear that perspective come from you, Dr. Rachel, being one of the originators from the concept of the whole cannabis health equity movement. So thank you so much for that. You know, you touched on some important points about coalition building and about a whole coalition leadership and everything. And we touched on it earlier about some of the expertise that's available in the coalition. But can the panel give us an example or give the audience an example of how we're using that coalition leadership to help build our individual businesses and to help augment our individual works? By the way, audience, we're all cannabis and hemp business owners and everything. So explaining this part of like why the coalition building is so important is because, as Dr. Rachel mentioned earlier, it's very important that we demonstrate our true power and the true power in coalition and the true power of when we come together and when we work together to help uplift each other.
Yeah, I'll take that, John. You know, I got to first say, I am over the moon excited to be a CHEM coalition leader, because I've had the opportunity to connect with a group of exceptional strategic partners that focus on equity-centric solutions that are of benefit as we reach outward as well as within our own group. As Pure Genesis' mission is education, access, and advocacy, is interesting that we very much align with CHEM and the CHEM philosophies and mission as well. And, you know, it is very simple that we do collaborate, we do demonstrate, we do deliver those community ecosystems through cannabis. But most of all, I'll say this, not only have I developed great partnerships, but also trusted relationships. This is very important, because as you pursue this industry, there are bad actors, and it is critical that you develop confident relationships, or if you're fortunate, family, as Dr. Rachel has shared, which can only strengthen your team as well as your ability to succeed. Now, I've been part of CHEM for a little less than a year. I'm coming up on my annual year here, Dr. Rach, so I'm looking forward to my anniversary cake. But it has been amazing as we've been able to, I think, explore, develop, launch, and more important, garner support through many initiatives that stem from the White House, USDA research grants, cannabis education grants, the National Hemp Association, as well as the private sector within the cannabis industry. So I would say we are prepared, and some may say the tip of the spear, or as Dasheeda says, go at it gangsta, as we forge ahead, you know, with quality programs and partnerships that center on community building, lobbying, investing, fundraising, and expanding our impact. You know, that, and I've learned tremendously in terms of the history and the science, thanks to Dr. Jessica and Dr. Knox, Dr. Rachel, of cannabis through CHEM. So I'm excited to be a part.
And just to add some commentary, if I can, because I think what Faye just described is so important in really illustrating the power of CHEM, because, you know, Rachel alluded to it too, the entourage effect, sort of in the macro level, the real world level above the, you know, molecular components of the entourage effect we see with the cannabis plant, where we recognize we can leverage one another's strengths and help fill gaps and rely on one another to build something that we wouldn't necessarily be able to build on our own. And, you know, it's unfortunate that the United States has this history of brutal capitalism that we have, you know, was really instituted from the founding days of this nation, and that we continue to practice, and that we see the patterns of it trying to play out in this, you know, budding cannabis industry, where Rachel talked about this a little bit in her history lecture earlier. But, you know, we have these examples of the previous big industries where, you know, there's typically a certain type of person at the top running everything, and it's generally for their own benefit or for the benefit of their friends at the expense of the larger population. And what we really want to do and demonstrate with our efforts through CHEM in the cannabis industry is that there is a different way to do it, that we can build an industry more effectively, more sustainably, more consciously, and, you know, to create the health equity that we believe we all deserve. And part of that is that we know that there is enough out here for all of us, so we don't need to, you know, cannibalize one another. I don't need to reinvent the wheel that Faye, or the wheel that Faye has already invented. But we have, you know, we have complementary skills and knowledge where we can really help one another, boost each other, and build something better and stronger and more sustainable than we'd be able to build it on our own. And that's really where the power of this coalition is. And we think, you know, we're onto something, and we hope we become an example for how all industries really should be playing.
Can I piggyback off of what both Faye and Dr. Jessica has shared here?
Give us some gems, brother. Travell gives nothing but the gems, y'all.
I apologize. I was having some technical difficulties here.
Travell, you also got to introduce yourself.
I'm Travell Bradford, founder and CEO of Mama Nature, which is a cannabis and agronomic solutions company that specializes in strategic management, all things cannabis. Also the founder of Oregon Trail Farms, which is a cannabis farm that helps individuals transition back into the community, into the agricultural space, particularly cannabis. And, you know, I have mixed feelings about the whole expungement, you know, wave that everybody's on. Oh, we're going to expunge your record. What people fail to realize is the expungement doesn't remove now that you have an FBI number because you've had contact with the police. That expungement is superficial, and that's a whole nother conversation. But the key as well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say I'm one of the co-founders of CHEM, AKA the mad scientist. I believe you can do anything with this plant. And I believe that particularly people of color, Black, should be at the forefront in this industry, similar to what, let's say, Koreans are with the Black hair care product industry and Jewish people with the diamond industry. I believe that with the history that's we've been a part of with this particular plant and the subculture before it became legal, just the entourage effect of the war on drugs, we should be at the forefront and collectively working together. Because I have also worked in several different phases of the industry, from cultivation to testing materials, the very first lab in the state of Oregon, Rose City Laboratories, I put together their logistics program for samplers. So I've gone all over the state of Oregon and I've tested just about anything you can imagine that has cannabis in it. What I have learned is that all farmers aren't created equal, and the consumer is the one who suffers from that. That's why I'm so grateful to have a team of educated doctors and professionals that are a part of CHEM. But not only that, you also run into the good old boys, consciousness of thinking when it pertains to this industry. Very few women, very few people of color. And what you'll run into is whoever you're partnered with, if those relationships aren't good relationships, they will enslave you to beat at their clock. So if you're in the supply chain and you're depending on a particular company to provide you with a isolate, well, hey, they may feel differently about you. And because you're by yourself, you really have no power. The beautiful thing about cannabis health equity movement is you have support in every particular ancillary business that pertains to the industry. And not only do you have that support, you have people who've been through it. You know, I've grown it from the seed, I've extracted it. I even market a line of Mama Nature CBD products, from everything from barbecue sauce to hot sauce. You know, I'm making gumbo for my 92-year-old father-in-law today with these same seasonings. And a bunch of church members are going to have their first try at CBD, okay? Because really the lack of education is suppressing us and holding us back. And the opportunity out there is vast, but we have to seize it together and strategically. If we act as crabs in a barrel, look at all the other industries that we've tried to participate in, and look at the market share that we as Black or people of color, what type of market share we have. Almost nothing. Right now together with the team that we have the force, we have the know-how and the expertise to help people do it the right way and not jump and fall into some of the pit holes that are out there, because there's so many out there. I like to say a funky pair of lips will tell you anything. And there's a lot of funky pair of lips in the industry, people.
Travell has the best sayings.
The best, the absolute best, y'all. Oh man, I'm sorry, brother. I just got to say that's a beautiful background behind you and everything like that. You know, as an original country boy and everything, that just brings me home a little bit. You know, being over here in California, it's a different scenery. It's beautiful, but sometimes just that good old country aesthetic that you got going on is great. You guys have talked about some very in-depth conversations that are just very reminiscent and just like near and dear to us and everything. And so also as a founding member of CHEM, and also as really, really close family members with everybody here, I have to admit that it feels really good to have a team and a group of people that not only are so knowledgeable in their own right, not only that are just really, really hitting the trails in their own lanes, respectively, with their own projects and businesses, but it's great to know that at any given point in time, I can call Travell, or just being a CHEM member and just being like a CHEM participant, I can call one of my members, one of my fellow members, one of my fellow leaders out here in the industry, and I can talk to them about different ideas about my business. I can talk to them about different ideas about my brand. And I have to admit, it becomes more important every day why it's so important to have the people that are sitting next to you be able to help augment and lift you up, and vice versa. So with that, what I'll go into on the next question for you guys is, you know, we've been doing a lot of work as an organization out there, and the work that we're doing is so pivotal. It's so important. Can we talk more about what we're doing with the CHEM Global Campus and where we look to see the CHEM Global Campus and how we're growing that in the next 2 years here?
Absolutely. So when we first were, you know, getting together and brainstorming ways we wanted to impact our communities in a big way, we had a coalition member propose an idea. And the idea was to consult directly to HBCUs. And that was just a seed, and that's really all we needed, because once that concept was introduced to us as a coalition member, we were meeting. We were just having meetups. It blossomed into what is now known today as CHEM Global Campus. And y'all should have seen Dasheeda in particular, our chief strategist, go to task with this concept. And we, you know, in those brainstorming sessions, we realized that the perfect impact partner for the type of work we want to do together to show how all the innovations of cannabis can truly bring healing to entire communities was to work with our HBCUs, right? Our HBCUs are those impact partners. By and large, we understand that our HBCUs have been poorly invested in, right? A lot of our HBCUs have no endowments or low endowments. We are seeing a decline in matriculation and graduation rates. We're seeing, curricular stagnation. When, like Dasheeda says, cannabis is making everything sexy again. We have an opportunity to shake things up in these schools, which are still historical pillars in our society, which are still centers of influence and excellence. And many of these schools are land-grant institutions. Many of these schools sit on a ton of land, right? Probably land that at one time was cultivated by slaves to produce hemp, right? So there's this amazing arc that exists when we talk about the role of HBCUs in this emerging multi-billion, probably trillion-dollar global marketplace. And true to our mission, we want to make sure that coalition members are thriving as effective operators in this industry. And that's what we believe for each and every HBCU, right? We want to see our HBCUs become legitimate operators in this space to participate in this multi-trillion-dollar industry so that they don't have to worry about quote unquote handouts, right? So that they can become the stewards of their own intergenerational wealth development on behalf of the institution, the students that they serve, and the communities that impact them or around them. Can't get a more perfect partner than that. And when we think about curricula development around cannabis and all the various stakeholders that are so necessary to make this industry go, right? This industrial cannabis industry work, then we understand that we can apply the disciplines to curricular development. And that's where we birthed STEAM, right? Our curricula in agronomy, science, technology, engineering, art, math, and medicine. And across all those disciplines, you can imagine the breadth of opportunity young people have to self-actualize into careers in this cannabis space, right? Creating programs and services and products that truly serve our communities. Oh my God, right? It gives me goosebumps every single time. That's what we hope to see. We know we have to start with education, right? That's why we always start these sorts of symposiums with the history, because we got to unpack a whole lot and to learn how we got to where we're at so that we can share the idea of destination, right? So if we believe in this paradigm of enriching ourselves to fill up, to pour out, we really need our schools, our HBCUs, to share in identifying in the role that we have to do that. So we would like to see HBCUs become chem hubs that communicate with one another, because we have medical schools and law schools, right, and ag schools. So just as we in Coalition are coming together, our hope is that our HBCUs can work, through that complex integration as well, all over this country, so that we as a community become so formidable in this space that we actualize intergenerational wealth via our institutions, via the enterprises that we set up. And again, just want to ride this point home, for the benefit of our community. This is what boosting esteem is all about. This is what creating entourage benefit for our communities means. And we're going to go the distance, right? It is cannabis health equity for us or bust.
I love it. Cannabis health equity for us or bust. That is a t-shirt. We got it. Rachel, we're going to talk offline.
That's a t-shirt, coin it. I just wanted to throw in the quick thought that what Rachel just described is so critically important, because we've seen what the alternative is, which is that, you know, we've seen instances in which there have been a few HBCUs that have really been taken advantage of by some of those, what did you call them, funky lips, Travell? We've seen, you know, some predominantly white organizations and entities come in and really try to capitalize on the resources of HBCUs, the fact that HBCUs have, some of them have licenses to grow and cultivate, and as opposed to, you know, these entities coming in and trying to help build capacity and build upon those resources with HBCUs and teaching them how to create all of these wonderful, you know, entourage benefits and community building efforts that Dr. Rachel just described. They're being used for their licenses, and the HBCU gets like a little piece of it. And it's so unfortunate to see, because it's very much a perpetuation of that same old model that we've seen all along. And so, you know, that's why the global campus is so important, because we're partnering with schools like SULC, or programs like SULC, to actually build the capacity and the abilities and the pipelines and all of these incredible things that will ultimately serve the school in the long run. You know, as Rachel said, we're talking about $1 trillion industry. There's no reason that our HBCUs shouldn't have a meaningful piece of that pie and be able to sustain themselves. But it's a matter of coming together and in coalition to build these opportunities together.
You know, also to piggyback on what you shared, and Dasheeda Dawson said earlier that, you know, cannabis is sexy. Cannabis is very sexy, especially for those that might be patients or recreational users. Love it, right? But when you start talking about cultivation and working in a field, cannabis isn't as sexy to everyone, okay? But we need to be able to convince our youth, we need to be able to convince our community that agriculture and self-sustainability is key to our generational wealth. What I'm saying is, I am a farmer, okay? I do that well. But I have slavery PTSD, people, okay? It's sexy, but 15 minutes into it, I have to drop my tool and run, just because of what my ancestors went through and the humility that one goes through when you touch the soil. Now, we really need to understand the essence of what we're doing. We're not just, hey, it's weed, come on, everybody, let's party. We are building future and community with a plant of healing, okay? This is a medicine of healing that has industrial principles that we can apply to everything in our life, from any type of material you think of. So we really, really, really have to focus on educating the sciences. We have all of these HBCU institutions. I'm the advisor with Oregon State University's Hemp Global Innovation Center here, and it was surprising to me when I found out I was once upon a time the only Black hemp farmer in Oregon. We have more, we have a lot more now, but there were only a few. And the irony of that, because I do have the history with, you know, dealing with marijuana and having that play a part in my life, but I turned it around. I saw the advantage to it, okay? I went from being able to be out in the field 15 minutes before having to run to being out there 30 minutes before having to run, okay? The key with our HBCUs, with all that land, is how do we farm that land more efficiently and take smaller components and produce more? Now we can do more with that asset. And the opportunity is there by bridging together collectively and beginning to teach curriculum to HBCU institutions, giving them an opportunity to let them know that a lot of these big companies, a lot of these other institutions don't have our community's best interest at heart on the surface. Maybe superficial, maybe post George Floyd and all that, but hey, you got to be able to spot dry land and muddy water, people. Okay, it's very simple. We come together collectively. We create our own internal supply chains. We partner with those groups that really want to help build our community and really help perpetuate us into the forefront to help build that community. These are the opportunities we have to look for and forge and continue to educate ourselves. You know, how many of you out there have a doctor that knows anything about the endocannabinoid system, okay, can really tell you some things about it? So we have too many of our people living in fear and ignorance about this particular plant, about the industry. And, you know, now is the time. So, you know, I would just strongly encourage anybody that is on this particular symposium and they're listening, really to begin to reach out and say, hey, you know, what is CHEM really about? Are they just some group that's coming together and, you know, saying cannabis is good and do this? No, we're a platform to help you build your presence in this industry. If you're in Louisiana, you got farmland, you can get in contact with us. I don't have to come to your farm, but I could tell you if your soil is a big girl, or I can tell you if the soil is a skinny girl, meaning one might need diet and one might need some supplements, okay? I can tell you if the water's good, things that people need to know before you start making these investments in this industry. There's been farmers last year who committed suicide. You know, we got some groups that are millions of dollars upside down because they didn't listen. They didn't want to do it the right way. So it's really key that you partner up with people that have done it already to make the best of your opportunity.
Powerful wisdom there, Travell. Really appreciate those pearls. You know, the business of cannabis, just like any other business, is quite serious, but always think about the cannabis and the hemp industries as your piece of the pie. And the reason why I say that is because, to Travell's point, I'm one of those individuals that has that family property in Louisiana and ain't doing nothing but growing weeds on it. But you know what? It could be growing weeds on it. And so these are the type of relationships that we like to cultivate and that we have in the CHEM Coalition, because Travell is absolutely going to help me get my family land popping. There's no reason why that's just an asset that's sitting there. It's not making any money, right? That makes me look bad. So with that and everything, I just want you guys to know, like, the work that we're doing is active. These are real conversations. I got a questionnaire in my email from Travell about what type of information he needs initially just to start the assessment and start having preliminary conversations about it. And I want everybody on here to understand and know that it starts with a conversation. Just keep on having them and keep on pushing.
And before you go, just to follow up real quick, also knowing whether you should be growing for cannabinoids or whether you should be applying for, your rec license or medical license, but whether, doing soil remediation on the field with a fiber varietal or a dual purpose with grain seed, okay, you just don't have to fall into one hole. You could have terrible land and remediate the soil and remove the carbon footprint there and receive carbon credits, okay? Just do somebody some game, run with it.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Travell is saying, and I think he is the Yoda of hemp. And I listen often to what he has to say because he has gems in every area of cannabis. So as I shared a little earlier, just in terms of real world today, last year we were very much invested in growing hemp for CBD. And as most of you are aware, CBD, there's a glut on the market right now, and the price, plummeted. So we pivoted to the CPG space and started developing CBD beverages. So it is absolutely necessary that you understand what the trends are, and you've got to make certain that you're investigating the hemp space accordingly. You know, how is it utilized? You know, right now, 23% of the market is hemp-derived CBD. You know, personal care is 22%, industrial applications 18%. What do you do with that information? You take a look at it and you determine the most profitable options with the most sources of revenue for your business. So is it growing? Is it processing? You know, is it developing building materials or products? You know, if you're seriously considering growing hemp, know that there was a glut. So what do you do with that? Because businesses are always looking for lighter, cheaper, faster, and better materials, and hemp is filling the void. You know, petrol and coal are not all the way out of the picture, but over the next 20 to 30 years, there's going to be a major shift towards hemp. Remember, there is less scrutiny with hemp as well. Interstate commerce is allowed, not subjected to 280E. You may have an opportunity to have 2 licenses, as Travell just mentioned, where you can grow it, or you can be a seed breeder, or you can create your own IP with different strains. That's amazing. You know, right now, as Dasheeda mentioned earlier, you know, you got Senator Schumer who's pushing the cannabis legislation through the CAOA Act. You know, look at that, because the proposed regulation for the FDA is encouraging to see that they are trending towards regulations versus making hemp in food and supplements illegal. That is excellent news for hemp. So if you're looking to process industrial hemp, there's so much opportunity with that as well. 50,000 products out there, people. And the byproducts that can be produced are amazing. The industrial hemp supply chain is very young, and the bottleneck is processing. So it's a great area to be in, as the bottleneck is global. So the opportunities are endless. You just have to do your homework. So trends and regulations, I would absolutely encourage you to focus on as you look at the industry. Those are a few thoughts.
Gems, all gems. Let's be real about it. We are trying to lead y'all to the water. Can't make you drink, but if you have an opportunity to take advantage of some of the knowledge that Faye, that Travell, that Dr. Jessica and Dr. Rachel are providing here, absolutely do it. Faye's an amazing individual in person and everything. I just want to take a moment to highlight just a little portion of Faye, because we have that engineering connection and love, just natural for each other and everything like that. Go ahead, drop him with another little pearl there, Faye, and let them know what type of brass you come from.
Well, I did have a chance to. I shared a little bit on my background when you were coming back in. So
okay, good. All right, we already touched on it. Yeah,
we did.
I gotta brag on this coalition and everything, because I get on these calls and we get on these meetings and everything. And I'm just like, I'm so happy just to be sitting here next to the type of like individuals and the type of people that they are, just at the business sense, at the career senses, but also just who they are as just human beings. And so that's why I wanted to make sure that I just had to highlight you, sis, because that is one of the things that is just absolutely beyond impressive. I mean, it blew my mind when we had that conversation that day.
Listen, let me just say this. I am over the moon, because as I entered into the space, you know, I was one of those who actually flew out to a Women Grow conference. And I said, am I going to be able to thrive in this industry? I don't understand anything about it. I'm very ignorant toward it. I have no education within it. Here we go, right? Ticket booked, flown out. And who did I meet? Dasheeda, right? So right then I said, I think I may have an opportunity to thrive in this market, in this industry. I came back, I was excited, I was renewed, I was charged up, and I got busy. But, you know, there's another piece to that too. And it's feeling the isolation of being in this industry and not feeling as though you have the support support that will give you the momentum to not just survive it, but succeed within it. And that's something that we don't talk about. It's the undercurrent that actually is running against you, right? It's the salmon upstream exercise. And really, you need more folks to go with you that you trust in, that you value, where you're aligned, and that you see you're similar in terms of the goals that you have. They don't have to be the same in terms of your business, but they do have to be the same in terms of your values and how you move forward in this space. So I'm very excited to be a part of the CHEM Coalition for that, because I do feel a part of the coalition. I do not feel as though I'm out here by myself. I do feel as though I have a lifeline, and that is important. And sometimes it's everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
It's an amazing vibe. It's an amazing vibe. And while we're talking about the vibes and like our coalition building and everything, you know, as much as we are about the business, the science, the medicine of cannabis, we're going to talk about a little bit of the health equity side of our conversation and why that is such an important pillar in the work that we're doing. Can you guys tell the audience a little bit about like why that is an absolute foundational pillar for our organization, and also about some of the things that we're doing to ensure that we're spreading that message in a mass and a broad way so that we can get more of our communities on board?
Yeah, I'll first say and softly level set that there is no health equity side. I know, John, that's just the way you framed it, but there's no health equity side. It is not a pillar. Health equity is the destination. It is our goal. It's our North Star. Health equity is touched by everything that touches us day in and day out, 24/7, 365 days a year. It's unfortunate that we have relegated the understanding and meaning of health to medical, right? To mean something synonymous to medical or to medicine or to the medical system. When we use the term health to describe the state of being of all sorts of things, right? We have healthy relationships. We have healthy bank accounts, right? We have healthy bodies. We have healthy minds. We have healthy land. Travell spoke to the needs of the land. Does it need to be remediated or what, right? All health means is a state of being. It says nothing about whether that's good or bad, right? Good or poor. Health, the way we use it, means total equity, health equity, universal equity. So again, it's the destination, as you learned from Dasheeda. Social equity is the vehicle that drives us there. If you can recall back to that slide, right, human equity encompasses mental, physical, and spiritual fitness. And that medical fitness is really where this big industrial medical system lives, right? And we put this idea of health equity on the shoulders of our medical system when that medical system doesn't know how to fix the ecosystem, right? What do you do when you go to the medical system, into a clinic or in a hospital? Your body's assessed and you might be put on a prescription drug or sent for a procedure, right? It tends to your physical body, but it's not tending to your relationships. It's not tending to your bank account. It's not tending to the health of the soil that you're toiling with, right? So I use the example of me as a family medicine doctor on purpose, right? Because I became a family medicine doctor because I thought that as that sort of QB along with that patient, I would know a little bit about a lot. And as the initial gatekeeper to the rest of the medical system, I felt like I could have an impact in maybe preventing a need for them to enter into that bigger system for, whatever failures that exist in society. Oh, that was the wake-up call, right? Because no matter how many prescription drugs I prescribe or how many services the system provides, or even in the world of cannabis. How many times I make a recommendation to use cannabis, if I continue to send my patients home into ecosystems that keep them sick, that keep them diabetic, that worsen their heart disease, right? That are causing cancer, then I'm never going to be helpful as a medical doctor, right? So health equity, again, we simply say it is the sum of 4 pillars of equity. It means equitable access to well-being and prosperity. And I think that is what we're trying to create for ourselves in cannabis. When we talk about social equity, we throw around terms like generational wealth and intergenerational wealth, and wanting to diminish the barriers of access to this industry. For the purpose of what, y'all? For the purpose of what? If we're not using this industry to pay dividends towards our future collectively, then we're actually getting into the industry for the wrong reason. So a lot of people are asking, how do you become a member of CHEM? And we'll work with Southern to identify who you are and to follow up with you. But one thing that you will have to agree on with us is that health equity is the destination that we want to collectively move towards. Right. So that does mean adopting our definition of health equity, and adopting our definition of social equity, and educating and advocating for change in our industry and change in our policies and regulations to create those pathways to health equity. It is, like I said before, our end all be all. If we're not in this space to drive change towards health equity, then you might as well not be in it. And we don't have time. We don't have time for it. We don't.
I love it. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. That conversation is so important as we talk about comprehensive health, especially in Black and Brown communities, with just the everyday stresses that we deal with each and every day. And I think that, my heart goes out to everybody that is experiencing the Olympics, the kind of like the way that I'm experiencing the Olympics. Like, I just feel like there's just been something after another. And, this clear differentiation and just like uplifting like this business over here, but you're penalizing probably one of the greatest athletes in the world over here. And like, these are like real conversations that, I have to explain to like sometimes my non-melanated friends and everything. It's a stress and it's a burden on us. And if we don't kind of take care of that comprehensively, not just in our bodies, but in our mental health, something that we don't talk about in Black and Brown communities a whole lot of, but we probably should. Cannabis and the industry is a conduit for that. And CHEM is a conduit to make sure that as you're on your journey, as you're exploring, as you're actually operating, that you have resources available in our networks and with each other so that we can just do those check-ins periodically. We do them all the time. Sometimes we start our meetings and everything, and we just do a quick little mental insanity check on everybody just to see how everybody's doing. And that's very important. What you say out there, brother? You hot? You burning up out there, man? Oh, man.
It's Africa hot in Oregon today.
Oh, man.
It's 102 degrees. It's 102 degrees. Jesus.
Oh yeah, y'all are really hot up there.
People don't know. People don't know what it's like here in Oregon. They think they know. I think it rains all the time.
This weather messing with my edges, y'all.
It's hot here too.
Oh man. All right. The next topic I have for us and everything. Thank you so much for explaining like why health equity is so important for us, and how it is the destination, and we really appreciate that. One of the questions that I have for us is, as we're talking about the whole policy piece of social equity in the cannabis space and everything, Dr. Rachel, as a cannabis commissioner in Oregon, I have to ask, outside of what's going on with the federal bill right now, or even just some specific parts of the federal bill. We just like to know what is kind of keeping your mind up at night when you're going through some of these updated policies that are counterproductive to inclusive participation in the cannabis and hemp spaces.
Yeah, I might have touched upon this before. Dasheeda did too. One of the biggest problems with our policies and regulation development is a fundamental misunderstanding of what equity is and means, right? Disagreement on what social equity is, no realization that health equity is a destination. And as a result, we're coming up with policies and regulatory frameworks that get us nowhere, right? Jess, you mentioned before too, like we're applying these concepts within brutal capitalism to this space, which is really undermining the potential of this plant to do what it was put on this earth to do. So what I recommend to policymakers and regulators is to start to decolonize our own minds, like start with us. That's why we lead with the history. We need to realize the part we have all played in getting us to where we're at right now, and then come to the room with that new framework in order to recognize that we are the social equity agents, and that all the policies and regulations that we create, we can answer. Who does this policy or regulation help? Who does it harm? And if we can identify who might be harmed from it, then we have to do the work to adjust so that we are doing our best to ensure that these policies and rules create an equitable space, right? If we're not that detailed in this process, we're going to miss the boat every single time, right? And then beyond that, which I think we're repeating again too, is that we need to hold the government accountable to monitoring, measuring, and improving, right? Nowhere in social equity, legislation, statute, or regulation do we ever read that those administering these programs have to monitor and report or improve. They're not coming up with KPIs. So if we're not monitoring how well we're doing, how are we ever going to ensure we arrive at that destination? How do we continue to hold accountable these systems to their failures? Right. So we kind of got to consider the destination and then reverse engineer the roadmap, right? And that roadmap begins with policy, right? And then the regulations just are intended to refine and focus and facilitate policy. So it begins with policy. I think that's what we're missing. Just we need to really improve the cannabis competency and the health equity competency of the folks who are being brought into these spaces. And that includes people of color, y'all, because there are a lot of leaders from within our community who are invited into these rooms, but who don't have this kind of understanding around health equity. And so that's another purpose of this coalition, so that we can come together, enrich one another, lean on one another, but also align ourselves to a common language and a common meaning, so that when we do start showing up at all these tables, right, federal cannabis policy work groups, or even if we're a small group of us, in a municipality going to our own city hall, that we are saying the same things, that we're demanding the same things. Because I can tell you a lot of the confusion is because our own people don't really know what we actually want.
Dr. Rachel, I so appreciate everything that you're saying here, especially as it relates to one of the pillars, which I believe is economic equity. And we don't talk about that enough in the context of there's community investment through tax revenue, which comes through policy, but we still continue to miss the boat in most states as it relates to capital that should be identified through disparity study for small businesses to move forward within the states as part of those communities, those underserved communities, or BIPOC or BILX communities. You know, that disenfranchisement is very real and is a clear barrier to opportunity for us to move forward. So, you know, as we talk about the health equity as it stems from the pillar of economic equity, it is a stifling barrier that is a very high hurdle, and policy can be impactful around that. You know, I was on the call yesterday with the governor of the state of New Jersey, and we were talking about adult use legalization and the support of diverse or BIPOC communities moving forward in this space, and how much of an imperative it is, and what's the roadmap forward. And first thing up was, where's the disparity study? And we've been looking to get that for a number of years now with, for example, New York, done, 25% of contracts going to minority businesses. We don't have that yet in New Jersey. So, you know, for those who don't know, the wealth gap in New Jersey is 40 to 50 times, not percent. So in other words, the average income for the Black and brown community in the state of New Jersey is about $5,000. And those who are not of the diverse background is 40 to 50 times greater. That's real data.
Wow. That is real data. I have to admit that James and I, when we started our business here in California, in Oakland, we participated in the equity program here, and that's actually how the city of Oakland was able to move the way that they did. They did that whole study with the data that showed not just the incarcerated rates, but the communities that have been ravaged kind of like in modern day times, you know, from the war on drugs, from cannabis arrests, and just like even the trauma from people that even weren't directly arrested or impacted by the policing, but just the trauma of the community in the neighborhood from the cops just going in there and terrorizing them. And it's those levels of disparity in our communities that are absolutely necessary to have those policy conversations. I can tell you that's one of the reasons why they're not too excited to get to it immediately. I will say that. The work that you're doing and having those conversations, and the work that everyone on the panel is doing to lead those conversations is quite important. But to have that perspective coming from you guys with the audience, we really appreciate that. And I know the audience does as well. I am...
John, real quick, I want to just dovetail from what Faye was saying and how important economic equity is, you know, by way of capitalization. One thing that I also think cannabis policy overemphasizes, it's not that it's not important, what I'm about to say, it is, but there is an overemphasis on supporting cannabis businesses owned by people of color. Our community is not going to survive on a bunch of cannabis, you know, dispensaries, even if those cannabis dispensaries are supplied by other, you know, Black entities in the supply chain. From a health equity perspective, we understand that other types of businesses should be funded by cannabis tax revenue also. Remember, cannabis prohibition directly impacted all determinants of well-being. It impacted our equitable access to whatever we want to do. Right. And so I would like to see cannabis tax revenues be truly invested in community. The Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act says, oh yeah, we want to invest in the community, and it lists out, a few things. It doesn't even touch medical. It says health education. What is it? What is that? Can you support organizations that are providing medical services to the community? Right. So again, we're starting to see a very narrow understanding of what all needs to go into creating health equity. We need to support all the stakeholders in our community that provide services that enrich our communities. I think we're missing the mark when we have this overemphasis on cannabis companies. Not all people of color who have been harmed by prohibition want to get into cannabis, and we need to be really respectful of that.
I 100% agree with you. And one thing I always have a challenge with is be careful of the tax revenue that's provided for the communities, because as that revenue is given, it can be taken away. So we have to earmark more of those dollars for capital to fund businesses, cannabis or otherwise, to your point, because it's not just about lifting a community up temporarily. I call it false revenues, because they're short term, right? Because what you can agree and decide on today, you can change tomorrow. But certainly, as you give life through capital for a variety of businesses, it allows those communities to be sustainable. So I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Rach. Absolutely.
Absolutely. These policy conversations are so very important, especially as we talk about how we're going to ourselves as an organization uplift our communities, only using cannabis and hemp as a conduit, but making sure that we fuel the comprehensive ecosystem, to your point, Dr. Rachel, to ensure that all of our businesses, all of our communities, everybody is able to benefit from the wealth that is being generated from these multi-trillion-dollar businesses and industries. And so much to the point where, cannabis and hemp is an international conversation. I know that we're having some international conversations in terms of what it looks like for, some of the Kim family to build a compound and, get the hell out of the United States. But, we'll have that conversation later and everything. Like, that compound living is a real thing, But the reason why
I'm down with it. Just no grape Kool-Aid.
Well, brother, since I got you queued up and everything like that, I was actually queuing this for you. Speaking of cannabis being an international conversation and everything, can you tell us a little bit about what international projects look like for aspiring cannabis and hemp entrepreneurs out here?
Well, I appreciate that. The opportunity is huge. Currently, my organization, Oregon Trail Farms, we've been doing some test runs of hemp in Kenya, and the opportunity is huge there. The government is supportive of anyone coming to set up processing there in the country. So for the last, 3 years, we've been doing these different trials with varieties to see what's going to work, what won't work. As far as human resources are concerned, you can get workers to work out there for little of nothing. And what we've done is we've really taken our mining project that we're doing there, where we're mining for gold, but rather than keeping that gold, we're reinvesting that gold back into the community. So it was just a perfect segue to bring hemp into that space, because of the flooding that'll happen, during the year in Kenya. You can't mine all the time or you'll drown inside one of those tunnels when they fill up with water. So it was just a perfect opportunity to, one, improve the food system there, from a grain perspective. And at the same time, you're strategically located to just really, really saturate the European market from being located in Africa. And I think we just really, really need to explore it. I have no problem going, but if somebody's going to start making grape Kool-Aid, I'm going to have a problem. I'm from the Bay Area, and Jim Jones did a lot of my relatives wrong back in the day. I'm just going to let you know. So no grape Kool-Aid for me. Grape juice, no grape Kool-Aid.
Say no to grape Kool-Aid. Oh man. Thank you so much for like sharing that, Travell. And I bring that up from a perspective and everything, because as we're talking about CHEM and we're talking about global campus and just global outreach, you know, it's very important for us as an organization to absolutely be involved in those conversations, coming from where a lot of the expertise has been, especially with the Knox doctors and the medical expertise that they have, you know, being the term coiners of the term endocannabinologist. We had this conversation in one of our chemistry classes the other day. And we invite you all to absolutely participate in those conversations on Clubhouse. Through the membership, we hold these sessions where we do a little bit of what I like to refer to it as professional development. Faye mentioned earlier that she learned so much from Dr. Rachel, Dr. Jessica, and the family about so many different things that on the business side, we're not exposed to as much. So it's always interesting to learn and to hear about those things, because for myself and for folks like Travell being a product developer, hearing about cannabis and the use of cannabinoids and how they engage and interact with consumers and patients is very important. It helps guide us on our product development side, and it really helps teach us about the products that we're making. I mean, as a business owner, you always want to make a responsible product that's actually helping people and not harming people. And that's just a part of like good ethos and everything for James Henry out here in California. And a lot of other brands out there. A lot of us have that same ethos in our businesses and our business practices. It's absolutely wonderful.
John,
James, before you leave.
Yeah, you made a really good point. I have to say this, because we don't talk about this enough. Black people in the United States are suffering at disproportionate rates from leading causes of disease: heart disease, stroke, cancer, complications of diabetes. What's really ironic is that these are all conditions that are preventable and reversible. They are reversible. These are not life sentences, but you go to the doctor, they're going to tell you you're on metformin for life, right? You're on lisinopril for life. You're on insulin for life. That is not true. And the endocannabinologist will understand that. So we need to increase the ranks of people, of health and medical professionals in our space that understand this and can work with a demographic of people who are not trusting of this industry yet either, right? Who aren't choosing cannabis over their pharmaceutical drugs because they trust their conventional doctor over, the dispensary attendant. Kind of get it. But we operators of color in this industry have this moment in time to really develop brands that impact the well-being of our community, like literally. We like to say a lot that the same product one person might recreate with, another patient can treat their cancer with. The same product. So we need our operators to be highly mindful about the types of products they're putting out in the marketplace, so we're not inadvertently harming our patients. I've had patients come to me with diabetic neuropathy, right? Pins and needles in their feet and toes, who tell me, I love my cannabis gummy. It effectively treats my pain. And I look at this product and it's full of high fructose corn syrup, full of colored dye, which are pro-inflammatory additives. Diabetes, right? Diabetes is the most common condition that leads to neuropathy, right? That chronic pain. It's also the leading cause of heart disease in our community. Is a disease of inflammation. So I scratch my head when I think about the products that we're creating for patients to treat symptoms, when these products could help reverse their condition. And when they're using it in that way, right, a product that has high fructose corn syrup and other things that are pro-inflammatory to treat pain, we need them and the industry and our doctors to understand that is simultaneously perpetuating a disease process that will never get them well. Right. So we actually do have a responsibility to truly serve in this industry. Please don't be putting high fructose corn syrup in your stuff. Don't, like, the cannabis is beautiful. It's perfect just the way it is. So let's not over commercialize this industry and relegate it to what I like to say a vice industry like tobacco is, or even like alcohol is. Like, we have this moment to really create a wellness industry out of this ecosystem. And just to back up to another question you asked about, policy and regulation, I am highly concerned that federal legalization is trending too close to recreational than to an adult use marketplace that's built on wellness. So we got to think about that. And I appreciate that James Henry is a company of integrity. Like, you have designed your product to serve, a leisure demographic who also wants to heal. But that's how sophisticated we need to get, y'all, in building our brands and building our supply chains. Like, work with people who have integrity, work with people, like Faye said, who are aligned in mission, understanding that the consumer is the only reason we exist in the first place. They are who we're serving, right? Not ourselves, not our pocketbooks.
That's right.
And reverse engineer your plan. Start from the end and reverse engineer whatever it is you're trying to do in this industry. If you reverse engineer it, you'll have an opportunity to succeed at it. If you don't, you're going to pay a lot of money. And we here at CHEM have already gone through the process. So we are masters at reverse engineering.
Yes, we are.
Let's heal. Let's reverse engineer healing that from diabetes, from heart disease, from cancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these patients can enjoy the recreational effect of cannabis while doing so. Okay, we can be all things to all people.
I'm here for a lifestyle consumption conversation every day, just because I think that it's, consumption is one of those things that, as long as you're doing it responsibly, you are tailoring it to the things that you're trying to accomplish with your consumption. That these are the type of functional cannabis conversations that we have to have more of in our communities, so that we can avoid the brands that are still doing kind of like the damage to our communities, because we're still out there naming cultivars things like cat piss and cheetah prowl and everything. That's they sound cool and everything, and there's a sexy side of that and everything. Maybe not, but look, I'm just like maybe not. But from the wellness side and from the actual like medicinal side, or just the equitable side of cannabis consumption, you find that you'll enjoy it more. And I think that Dr. Rachel and Dr. Jessica will absolutely agree, Travell as well. You will absolutely enjoy the products more if you learn and you actually practice using them from a wellness perspective, and also from a responsibility perspective as well. Responsibility meaning that, maybe a CBD flower during the daytime, if you're a daytime consumer and everything, absolutely try that. The same thing when you need to go to sleep at night, you need something deep, go for an indica dominant product. And it doesn't have to be flower. Love my flower and everything like that. When I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell here and then, I think they might kick me off the camera here and everything like that. When I tell y'all I love my flower, and I just want to say shout out to the great farmers in California that's just like doing these big nugs out here for us and everything. This is something that you might find in the James Henry jar. I'm just going to plug that real quick. No, but seriously and everything, I absolutely love hearing the doctors talk about responsible consumption and just the patient perspective, because it's helped me in my path and my journey so much. And I remember before actually having the chance to like meet them and have a conversation with them and everything like that, all of their content was just like dope. So make sure you guys do a little bit of YouTube research and everything. They just have tons of things out there where they're just dropping nothing but bombs and pearls on everything that we're talking about here today, and anything that you want to know about. Pure Genesis is doing some great things as well. I know we're on the closeout and everything, and I just wanted to give the panelists a little bit of opportunity to drop one last pearl, one last nugget on us from that CHEM leadership and from that CHEM coalition spirit. You know, the people in the audience, you've attended the SULC Cannabis Symposium so that you could get some knowledge, learn some things, maybe get more interested in becoming more active and engaged in the industry from an entrepreneur perspective, either plant touching or non-plant touching. And that's great. You know, what is your number one kind of like pearl that you can leave us with this evening?
Ooh, number one pearl. There's been so many pearls dropped, mic drop moments, I would say, today, and so appreciative of them because anytime we're able to participate in these as panelists, we're also being educated at the same time. You know, don't think we come fully apprised of all educational aspects of the cannabis industry. We do not. We learn from each other. And I think for me, that is the biggest pearl that I always know when I'm in the company of CHEM leaders, I am going to learn as well as provide. And that is always a well-balanced homeostasis state that my body stays in as a result. So the entourage is everywhere. And it is only when I see you guys, I feel that way. I understand that. I am inspired by it and I'm motivated by it. So the engine comes on when there is a CHEM initiative that is in play. So I appreciate you guys. And for those of you who are interested in CHEM, give thought to that because I don't see where I've been able to get that outside of this group. Thank you, John.
Agreed. That's a powerful statement of agreement, sis. For real, Faye. I mean that.
It's the truth.
Let me jump in before we get doctor's orders to finish off. I am one very grateful of the CHEM family and everyone involved. Leadership. One of the beautiful things about the leadership within CHEM, it's a forward-thinking group of people that think of others before themselves. And I've had the opportunity to kind of witness this and sit back and watch. The other great thing is that if I'm feeling tired or I can't push forward, my team members here have the bandwidth to get us over the finish line in the different projects. And that is very helpful when you're out here in the industry trying to lift the load of, you know, staking a flag in this industry, you know, when you have partners that have answers. And if they don't have the answers, they know the people who do have the answers and they can get them to you quickly and cost effectively. Okay. So that is very important, especially for me. Like I said, I've been, well, I probably didn't mention this, but I've been cultivating cannabis over 35 years. So I just probably let a few people know how old I am. I'm closer to 100 than I am 0. So I've seen it all come, and you know, we've hit on it. You know, really understanding what you're consuming, what works for you. I have a coin phrase. We call it kill zone, kill zone. Kill zone cannabis, KIL. Keep it lit. Good weed, you keep it lit. The rest has to quit. And it's a crosshair that you dial into. My kill zone mark is different from yours, and yours is different from mine. So I may not eat any gummies because that's just not how I ingest. Okay, that will make me feel different. I don't want to be looking at you from the moon. But having an understanding of, okay, well, maybe I can blend, you know, some CBG, a little bit of THC, and, you know, some essential oils to, you know, get me to where I need to be. Like I said, I'm dealing with slavery PTSD, and I'm pretty sure most of y'all looking at me dealing with it too, but don't want to admit it. That's another conversation. But the opportunity here is limitless, okay, to partner up on some cutting edge things. We only talked about a little bit. You know, they just sent 2 people into space on their own aircrafts, right? Into space. Materials can be built from this plant to go into space. It's all cutting edge. The fuels used to move things with this plant. So we really, really have to take it seriously, be educated, get around professionals, get you a good lawyer, a great CPA, and a CHEM membership if you can.
That's a t-shirt too, Travell. Get you a lawyer, get you a good CPA, and get you a CHEM membership, baby. I love it.
How do you add anything to that?
I know, and I feel like we the gems are just being dropped the whole time. Anyways, yeah.
Oh man,
Travell, close this out.
Ah.
No, honestly, I don't know, Dr. J.
I don't know either. I think one of the things you said, Dr. DK3.
DK4, DK4.
I think one of the things you said really, really hit, and I think is worth repeating, which is, for people to understand what the ultimate goal is, where the destination is, which is health equity, and that we should not be looking at cannabis as, as this like singular end in and of itself. If we're looking at cannabis as just our quick way to get rich, which is how a lot of people are looking at it, we're coming at this all wrong. And we really do need to use as a North Star all of the potential of what this plant can do, not only for ourselves as individuals, but for our communities, for our globe. And, all of the panelists up here this afternoon have talked about the many ways that cannabis can do so much good for such a broad target. And so I would just encourage people to keep that in mind. And that, that really comes with knowing the history that Dr. Rachel spoke about earlier. Understanding that context really helps frame, why and how we are where we are now, but also where we could be doing things so much better if we just keep our perspective where it should be. So, yeah, I guess I would just encourage folks to really meditate on that and find your path. There's so many different opportunities within this space, but ultimately we are all trying to get to the same place.
Love it.
Yeah, me too. I suppose all I will say is get the knowledge. Get knowledge. Faye so aptly put it. We are always learning. We're always learning from one another and learning more about the history, learning more about the science, learning more about the industry, learning more about the ways we need to influence policy and regulation so that we begin to get it right. But the foundation of all of it is education. We have to educate forward everywhere and anywhere we go if we want our communities to truly be served, because they also have to receive from us, right? They have to accept what we're trying to give them. And we also need to, we say we know our community, but do we really, if we're not including them, in the conversation too? So continue to educate that everything you've learned here with us today, beginning with that history, begin to share, right? Share this forward, use the history and the science as evidence that validates the goodness of this plant. We have to start destigmatizing this plant in all of our conversations. I'm sure many of us even might be guilty of withholding or hiding, right? Depending on what arena we're moving in, and that we have to be stealth with how we move in this space yet and still. But my point is that we need to show up. We need to accurately speak to the history and the science and the benefits that we know that this plant can provide for our communities, and be really convicted about it and hold nothing back, because that information is, I think, our most effective tool at this moment in time, right, in 2021, and we still have states fighting against legalization. The education right now is our weapon. So wield it wide, wield it broadly, wield it judiciously. Because we can't go anywhere without, that core competency fulfilled. So get knowledge and continue to pass it forward.
Thank you all for that. We really appreciate the opportunity to kind of receive that knowledge in that space from you guys. And I think it's mutually felt that we just want to make sure that CHEM thanks Southern University and all the participants for allowing us to take up some space, take up some time on your Friday mornings, on your Thursday mornings and afternoons. And we truly hope that you guys left with some knowledge and just like some pearls to just be inspired and just be excited about going online and getting that CHEM membership. Make sure you join our organization, join our cause with us and everything. If you share in the same ethos and if you want to participate with us and just grow and have the opportunity to learn with us as well. And with that, I think that I will go ahead and close it out. I know we're a little bit over, but man, we just had to get those last little moments in and everything. We really appreciate you guys for sharing with us.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Thanks,
Absolutely.
everybody.
John.
Appreciate you, brother.
Absolutely appreciate y'all. Y'all have a good one.
You too.